Chapter 1. Joanne Larson clutched the shoulders of Dr. Dylan Drake as he kissed her passionately. She was perched at the very edge of her counter, legs spread, with Dylan standing between them, his hands under her button-up work shirt. Without thinking, one leg wrapped around his waist, and she moaned softly. "I need you, Joe. Let's go to your bedroom." The words were like cold water was dumped over her head, and Joe took deep gulping breaths to reorient herself. "I'm not ready, Dylan." "Not yet," Dylan groaned, resting his forehead against hers, his eyes closed against the intensity of emotions. A thin sheen of sweat covered his face. "It's always not yet." "When?" "I have to set a good example for Mary Beth. I'm her role model." Dylan stepped back, running his fingers through his already mussed hair in obvious frustration. "She's 21. What difference does it make? We're not married. You know how much that matters to me." Joe slid off the counter and walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his shoulder. There was a huge disparity in their height, and she felt tiny in comparison. "I do know how much it matters. I also know I've asked you 3 times, and there's always some reason you're not quite ready. When will you be ready, Joe?" Dylan kept himself rigid as he waited for her answer. She sighed. "I don't want to cross a line with you we can never get back across. You're my best friend. I don't want to lose what we have." Dylan turned in her arms, looking down into her upturned face. He cupped one cheek with his hand. "I told you I'd wait, and I will, just don't make me wait forever." He kissed her one last time, before heading toward the door. "I'll be here in the morning to check on the mare and new foal." "Thanks, Doc," Joe said, a slight smile transforming her face. Dylan closed the door behind him, and Joe stood still for a moment until the director called out, "Cut." Valerie rubbed her hand over the back of her neck, surprised at the sweat she found there. She got more worked up from the short kissing scenes she and Jesse did on set than she did from an hour makeout session with Curtis, her boyfriend of 8 years. Of course, she hadn't let Curtis kiss her much in months. She didn't feel the kind of passion for him that she did for her co-star, Jesse. What was wrong with her? She looked over at the director, Steven, and nodded. "We done for the day?" Steven nodded. "You two almost lit the cameras on fire with that last scene." "I don't know how you do it." Valerie shrugged, ignoring her body, which was still burning from the embrace. "We're actors. It's our job." It was then she noticed Curtis standing a few feet behind Steven. She walked to him, trying to keep the annoyance from her face. "What's he doing here? How did he get around the no visitors on set rule again?" Curtis took her hand and kissed it, giving the impression he was madly in love with her, which he always did, in public. "I've missed you. I hope you don't mind me flying here to surprise you." She did mind. More than she should. "No, I don't mind," she lied. "Let's go to my trailer." Looking at his face, she could see Curtis was angry. Again. He must have seen the kiss. The kiss she had to do for her job, that was written into the script. She held his hand as she led the way around the cameras and out the door of the ranch house to the trailer that was set up for her use. Valerie was the star of Lazy Love, a show that was making all her dreams come true. As she opened the door to the trailer, she couldn't help but remember the audition for the show. She'd been a green girl, just in from Iowa State University, sure she'd set Hollywood on fire with her talent. After only 2 auditions, they'd paired her up with Jesse. He'd read the role of Dr. Dylan Drake, small-town veterinarian, while she'd read for the role of Joanne Larson, heiress and debutante, whose father had died unexpectedly, leaving a ranch in her very soft hands. Valerie had felt like she was made for the role instantly, and Jesse's reading of Dr. Dylan had inspired them all. For years later, they were both still playing their roles for the primetime drama. She turned and looked at Curtis, readying herself for the fight she knew was about to come. Moving as far from him as she could without being obvious, she leaned casually against the wall, trying not to look afraid. "Why? Can you just tell me why?" The anger on his face changed him from a handsome man to ugly. This was the face she was used to seeing, not the face he showed the rest of the world. Valerie shrugged, keeping her uncaring mask in place. I guess I'm just good at my job. She knew he wanted to know why the passion between her and Jesse was so intense, and she couldn't even fake it with him. She'd tried to break up with him multiple times in the past, but he'd always gotten angry, scaring her, so she'd left their relationship as it was. The one thing she wanted more than anything else on earth was to leave their relationship in the past. No one is that good. I kiss you, and I can feel the ice forming around your lips. He kisses you, and the passion that emanates off both of you has the crew wiping the sweat from their faces. Valerie continued to stare at Curtis, not knowing what to say to him. The truth, that she had no feelings for him, would only anger him more. She couldn't work with bruises on her face. No amount of makeup could fix the damage he would do. Why don't you kiss me that way? She closed her eyes for a moment, but she knew it was time. What could he do there in her trailer? There were people all around them. Jesse's trailer was close enough, he'd hear her scream. She prayed he'd be there in time. Because I don't have any passion for you, Curtis. I think it's time for our relationship to be over. I don't love you. Curtis picked up a vase from the table beside him and threw it at her, hitting the wall just next to her head. We're not over. The door crashed open, Jesse's eyes blazing. Oh, trust me. You're over. Get off this set. She's done with you. Curtis glared at Jesse, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. What gives you the right to interfere with my relationship with Valerie? You're just her boyfriend in the show. She's not yours in real life. Jesse shrugged. She may not be my girl in real life, but she is my friend. I don't let people throw things at my friends. He opened the door to the trailer pointedly. Get out. Valerie looked back and forth between the two men, hoping they wouldn't come to blows. She knew Jesse was strong, but Curtis was huge, a good 4 inches taller than her co-star. She didn't want to think about what could happen. And neither she nor Jesse needed the negative publicity that would come from a fight. Curtis looked at Valerie. If I leave now, it's over between us. And I'll make sure every newspaper in the country prints the story of how we broke up, because you're frigid. How you can't stand for a man to touch you when a camera isn't on you. Valerie glared at him. Fine. Get out. I never want to see you again. He was giving her an out, and she'd take it. Getting away from him was a higher priority than her reputation. Curtis stormed toward the door, and Jesse made sure he closed it after the other man. As soon as the door was closed, Valerie sank down onto the couch and buried her face in her hands, sobbing. She wasn't upset about losing Curtis. No, she was glad he was gone. It was what the tabloids would print. She'd been called Valerie the Virgin for so long she was ready to scream. Now they would have even more fodder. But to be rid of Curtis was worth it. Jesse sank to the couch beside her, his arm going around her shoulders. Val, you don't need him. He's worse than being alone. Valerie nodded, sniffling indelicately. His touch made her feel safe, and she rested her head against him, thankful for his tender care. I'm glad he's gone. I just. Jesse looked at her, confusion on his face. He'd never understood how someone as beautiful and sweet as Valerie could be with a dishabag like Curtis anyway. Just what? I don't want to see how Valerie the Virgin wouldn't put out, so he had to dump her. I don't think I can stand it. What's wrong with having morals? Jesse nodded slowly. The windows were open. Valerie stared at him for a minute and then it dawned on her what she'd said to Curtis. You heard everything? Yes, I did. Does it really matter to you if you're accused of being frigid? Because as we both know, you're not. She sighed. I don't know why, but it does. It's not true. I'm so sick of reading lies about myself in the tabloids. So don't read them. If I don't read them, then I'm blindsided when asked about them in an interview. When my mother calls. Something always happens, so I read them and I keep up on the gossip. Marry me then. Jesse kept his face impassive and his eyes steady on her face as he made the suggestion. He couldn't let her know how very much it meant to him. What? Are you crazy? Look, we know we have passion between us. Heck, the whole cast and crew is breathing heavy after we film a scene like we did today. We genuinely care about each other. Why not? His mind raced for further arguments, because he had to make the most of this opportunity. He couldn't see her dating another man again. It would tear him apart. She stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. I'm not sure that's a good reason to marry. I mean, we've never even kissed with no cameras rolling. Jessie grinned the dimpled smile that had millions of women tuning in every Tuesday night and swooning over him. He reached to her, one hand cupping her cheek as it had so many times before, but this time, it was real. It wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for anyone but her. Valerie's heart beat faster, pounding out a rhythm that almost hurt within her chest. His lips were as familiar to her as her own, because she'd kissed him regularly for 4 years, but this was different. There were no cameras, no other actors, and most importantly, no directors telling him how to kiss her. This time it was just them. And she wasn't sure if her heart could survive it. If I can prove to you that kissing is just as good for us off camera as it is on, will you marry me? His mind raced as he tried to come up with a good reason for her to marry him. The entire time he'd known her, she'd been tied to Curtis, and he wasn't going to let this magic opportunity slip by him. No, Valerie, his co-star and the woman of his dreams, was about to be his if it took everything inside him to make it happen. Why? What will you get out of it? Valerie shrugged. I know that I won't be humiliated in every tabloid in the country, but you? What's in it for you? He let out a low deep chuckle, rubbing his thumb over her lips. I get the passion that everyone sees and feels when we kiss. I get to touch you and make love with you. I get a wife that I already care for. What else could I possibly want? She swallowed hard. So you want a real marriage? We're not talking about a marriage in name only to help our ratings. Was she ready for that? No, we're not. I'm talking about a marriage where we make love as often as we can. Where we set the real world on fire, not just the television. I'm not sure I could do that. He laughed. I'm sure I could make you forget that you're even a little worried about it in 10 minutes flat. She rested her cheek against the hand still touching her. I'm not sure this is a good idea, Jessie. Will you let me try? He wouldn't kiss her against her will. He'd been well aware of how controlling Curtis was with her for years. No, he would treat her as he always had. As his friend and co-star. As the woman he wanted to spend forever with, whether she recognized it or not. Valerie stared into his familiar eyes, thinking about how good his lips had felt on hers just minutes before. Finally, she nodded. Yes, I'll let you try. Jessie's eyes lit up, the way they always did when he went to kiss her. He leaned down toward her, something he'd done a million times, and his lips brushed hers, softly. She swayed into him, her hands moving up to grip his shoulders tightly. This was familiar. This felt so good to her. Jessie's lips on hers. His hands touching her. She parted her lips, and his tongue moved sweetly in to sweep through her mouth, also a familiar feeling. But the familiar feeling brought the same reaction it always did. She felt her nipples harden against his chest, and she wanted nothing more than to move closer to him. Within moments she was on his lap, straddling him. His hands were under the loose-fitting button-up shirt she'd thrown on over a t-shirt for their scene. She hummed low in her throat. Jessie tore his mouth from hers, his breath coming in deep gulps. Marry me. Now. She stared at him. Isn't there a waiting period to marry in Texas? Her mind raced to come up with all the reasons she shouldn't go through with this, while her body screamed at her that he was the one man she needed in her life. He shrugged. I have no idea. If there is, we'll fly to Vegas. Tonight. We have to film on Monday. We can be back by Monday. It's Friday. 2 days. She bit her lip, staring into his eyes, only then realizing the position she was in. Never had she kissed Curtis the way she'd just kissed Jessie. It would never have occurred to her to try to get closer to him the way she always wanted to be closer to Jesse. Why did she feel so much passion for this man, when she felt nothing for the man she'd been with for so long? I don't know if that's a good idea. She shook her head. You know me. I believe marriage is forever. So do I. I think you and I could make a better marriage than anyone else I know. She moved to the couch beside him, her face bright red with embarrassment. How had she ended up on his lap anyway? She didn't remember moving there. You know I'll treat you like a princess. There's so much between us. Why hesitate? Do something spontaneous for once in your life. He wanted to sweep her off her feet and carry her into her small bedroom at the other end of the trailer. He knew she'd marry him once he'd made love to her, but he couldn't do that to her. She had to make the decision without guilt in the mix. She frowned at his words. Curtis had once used them to try to get her into his bed. He'd been sure she'd been overthinking everything, which was a bit true. His kisses never held her attention, so she'd had plenty of time to think while he'd tried to persuade her to do what she didn't want to do. But this was Jesse. Her best friend. Her co-star. The only man alive who could set her body on fire. Finally, she nodded. On one condition. I don't want anyone to know we're marrying to keep me out of the tabloids. I want everyone to think we did it for love. Jesse nodded. I don't want anyone to think anything else. He stood, capturing her hand in his, and dragged her out of her trailer and toward the main house, where he knew the director and producers would be re-watching their footage of the day, making certain nothing needed to be res hot. What are you doing? I'm going to talk to Steven. Tell him we'll be back Sunday evening. Are you going to tell him we're going to get married? As the words passed Valerie's lips, she realized just how much they meant to her. She was marrying a man she respected and cared for. A man she could love, someday. When Steven saw them walking toward him hand in hand, he grinned. You two finally figure out what the rest of us have known forever? He asked. Jesse grinned at the words. Everyone had known how attracted he was to Valerie forever. He couldn't hide his obvious reaction to their kissing scenes. No other woman had ever made his body react that way, with so many people watching. There was just something very special about Valerie. We're taking off for the weekend. Steven raised an eyebrow. You are? Didn't I just see Curtis? He looked around as if expecting the man to pop out of nowhere. Valerie hid her internal cringe at the name. She knew he'd cause problems if he could find a way. I called it quits with Curtis. Jesse and I are flying to Vegas to get married. The grin that split the older man's face surprised Valerie. Did everyone hate Curtis? I guess you approve, she asked. Anyone who has ever seen you two together approves. Jesse smiled at the words, lifting Valerie's hand to his lips and kissing it softly. We'll see you Monday morning. I'm sure we'll get back Sunday night, but I'm not wasting a single minute hanging out with you freaks when I could be alone with her. Steven laughed. No one's arguing with you there. He waved his hand in a shooing motion. Go. Have fun. Be ready to work on Monday. We will, Valerie promised. She looked at Jesse. We'll have to spend at least some time working on learning our lines this weekend. We'll take the scripts on the plane. They separated for a few minutes while they packed their bags, getting ready for the trip. Then they drove the hour-and-a-half drive to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport from the small ranch outside Wiggyville, Texas, where the show was filmed. It was easy to catch a first-class flight to Vegas, because there were planes leaving every hour for the popular tourist destination. As they waited for their flight to be called, Valerie glanced at Jesse, who was reading his script, but clutching her hand. Have we lost our minds? Lost them? On the contrary, I think I found mine. He squeezed her hand and continued reading his script. Once they were on the plane and buckled, she snuggled under the blanket provided. I may sleep on the way there. Are we getting married as soon as we land? He nodded. That's my plan. I'm not spending another night without you in my arms. Maybe we should take it slow. Get used to being married. She knew he didn't want to wait for sex, but she wasn't certain she could just jump into bed that fast, even with Jesse. Sure. No problem. We'll take everything nice and slow. Jesse pressed his lips against her ear. Except the sex. That's going to be hot and crazy. She felt warm just thinking about it. She knew she was blushing. You need to behave yourself. She rested her head against his shoulder, knowing she really didn't want him to behave. She felt so comfortable with him in a way she never had anyone else. Oh my God. It's Dylan and Joe. From Lazy Love. A teenaged girl was standing in the crowded aisle looking at Jesse and Valerie. Valerie smiled. Hi. She reached automatically into the oversized bag she always carried for a publicity photo of her with Jesse and took out a pen. Who do you want me to make it out to? My name is Megan. The girl spelled it slowly. I watch your show every week. Her eyes darted back and forth between the two actors. Are you two a couple in real life? Jesse smiled. Can you keep a secret? He asked, knowing the girl wouldn't keep what they were doing a secret, and that was the reason he wanted to tell her. He wanted their elopement in the press before Curtis could get his story there. Megan nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. Yes, I can. Anything for you. We're on our way to get married. No one knows except our director. Megan's hand went to her heart. Seriously? You're getting married in real life? Jesse nodded before taking the photo from Valerie and signing his own name to it. He handed it to her, while Valerie spoke. He's telling the truth. In a few hours, we'll be married. Valerie put her hand on Jesse's thigh, breathing a sigh of relief when he squeezed it with his own. She was so nervous. Not since the audition for the part of Joe had she been quite this nervous. Maybe it was only the really important things in life that made a woman so nervous. Wow. That's so cool. When will you get married on the show? Valerie smiled at the question she was so used to hearing. As soon as the writers write it in. I'm glad we don't have to wait for them in real life, though. Her eyes were on Jesse's face as she spoke. Not as glad as I am, Jesse muttered under his breath as the girl was moved down the aisle toward the back of the plane. I can't believe we're doing something quite this spontaneous. It took us 6 months to even kiss on the show. There's a big difference though. I've been kissing you for 4 years as we film. I don't want to wait for a long engagement. Whatever they do with Joe and Dylan, Valerie and Jesse are going to live the lives they want to live. And I want to be with you every minute of every day. Her breath caught at his words. Really? He chuckled softly. I haven't made that obvious with everything I do. How many nights have I been at your place until 3 in the morning, practicing the lines I'd had memorized for days? She grinned. You were helping me. You're a good friend. I'll be a better husband, he said with a grin, his dimples showing. You will? He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Oh yeah. She reached out and caught the front of his shirt, pulling him to her for a kiss. I'll be a good wife to you. He returned her kiss, a smile on his lips. It was something her character had done many times, and he liked the way life was imitating art. Joe was much more outgoing than Valerie was. He was surprised an actress could be as tender-hearted and nervous as his co-star. Where are we staying? She asked, as she pulled back from the kiss. As many times as they'd kissed in front of a crowd for a television camera, she still didn't feel like kissing in public was something they should be doing. I got us a suite at Caesar's. Not that we're going to need any more than a bed. She blushed at that. We're going to have to eat as well. Speak for yourself. He caught her hand and brought it to his lips. I don't want to set foot outside that room even once. Room service? He shrugged. I guess we can do that. She shook her head. Are you trying to channel Dylan? Dylan thinks about Joe the way I think about you. No need to channel him. I've given the writers lots of ideas for what he'd say to Joe. Have you really? She hadn't heard that at all. He nodded emphatically. I even thought about writing an episode once, but the producers said we couldn't spend an entire show in bed, so I gave up on the idea." She laughed softly. "Jesse, you are so bad." He shrugged. "That's why you're marrying me." Valerie frowned at that. She was marrying him because he made her feel safe. The passion was just a bonus. He wouldn't let anyone hurt her. Ever. She thought back to an episode where some men had gone into the ranch house with rifles, because they were hiding out from the police. It had been her mild-mannered veterinarian who had rescued her, and she'd rushed into his arms. Never had she felt so at peace as she had filming that last scene of the episode. He caught her look and frowned. "Why do you think you're marrying me?" He was almost afraid of what her answer would be. With as long as he'd had feelings for her, she'd never given any indication she returned them. Other than the passion she brought to their kissing scenes, of course, and that passion told him everything he needed to know about how she really felt. He just hoped she was aware of her feelings for him. She looked down at her hands, trying to find the best way to tell him how she felt without hurting his feelings. Well, you make me feel safe. I love our passion, don't get me wrong. But it's the security I crave from you." He nodded, slowly. "I can understand that. In a week, you'll forget you ever felt safe with me." She looked at him with surprise. "I will?" "You'll be too busy remembering how good the passion feels to worry about security." She rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. "You're probably right. So I'll enjoy feeling safe with you until we get to Vegas." He put an arm around her shoulders. "Do you want me to wake you when the meals come?" Valerie shook her head. "No, I'm more tired than hungry." His smile looked positively feral. "Then you sleep. I'll wake you when we land." He kissed the top of her head as she snuggled in even closer. She'd need all the sleep she could get. Chapter 2. 5 hours later, Jesse ushered Valerie into their suite at Caesar's. "I'll buy you a ring when we get back to Texas," he promised. "I hope you don't feel less married because you don't have one." She looked at her bare hand. "I don't think I feel any less married without one. I don't feel married at all." "How does married feel?" He locked the door behind him and pulled her into his arms. "Marriage feels just like kissing does." I've only ever really kissed 2 men. One made me feel dirty, and the other made me feel like I was flying." "What? You've only kissed Curtis and me?" "How could that be true? I kissed a few others for shows, but I never meant it when I kissed them. And there had never been any acting involved when it came to kissing Jesse." "And I'm the one who makes you feel like you're flying?" "Well, I wouldn't mind if my kisses made you feel a little dirty." He waggled his eyebrows at her. "No, your kisses don't make me feel dirty. Curtis's made me want to go use Listerine." "Why?" He'd known there were problems in her relationship. He'd seen them in the early days of their friendship when she'd often invited him to spend time with them. The last 3 years, he hadn't seen them together much. She shrugged. "I don't know. When you kiss me, I can't think. My knees turn to mush, and my brain goes on vacation. That's why I'm always messing up kissing scenes." "Ah. I was hoping you messed them up so we could have fun refilming them." She grinned at that. "No, you're the one who does that." Shaking her head, she tried to explain. "When Curtis kissed me, my mind didn't shut off. I had to think about where to put my hands and what to do. And he always called me frigid." "Is that where Valerie the Virgin came from?" he asked. Valerie made a face. "No. That was my mess up. In my first interview after I was cast as Joe, somehow my morals came into it, and I said I was going to stay a virgin until I married. So I became Valerie the Virgin. Do you have any idea how sick I am of being called Valerie the Virgin?" He grinned at her. "Don't worry. After tonight, it won't be accurate at all." She backed up until her shoulders were against a wall, and he slowly walked toward her, kissing her as he pressed her against it even more. "Why does my brain turn to mush every time you touch me?" she asked. "I don't know, but I'm glad it does." He kissed her once more before scooping her up and carrying her into the bedroom. I need to shave first, she told him, blushing slightly. It was winter, and they filmed cool weather scenes. There'd been no need for her to shave her legs. She couldn't let him see, or worse, touch them the way they were. He sighed. Do you really think I care? Whether you do or not, I do. I don't want to make love to my husband for the first time with hairy legs. She didn't mention her armpits, because she thought it would be indelicate, but they needed a good shaving as well. Okay. How about I order room service while you shave? How long did it take a woman to shave anyway? Will you be long? Probably about 30 minutes. She hadn't had anything sexy to wear for him, so she'd borrowed something from Amber, the girl who played her sister, Mary Beth. I'll let you know when room service has left, he told her. She nodded, rushing into the bathroom to take care of her unsightly hair. 45 minutes later, she was standing in the bathroom in a long silky pink nightgown with spaghetti straps. She was freshly shaven, and her hair was brushed into silky waves around her shoulders. She jumped at his knock. Yeah. Food's here. You can quit hiding. She sighed, pulling the bathrobe from the back of the bathroom door. He was right. She was hiding. She opened the door to find him leaning against the opposite wall, with his arms folded against his chest, watching her every move. What did you order? She asked, tying the belt more tightly around her waist. Are you cold? He asked. She shook her head. Really, the bathrobe made her a little too hot, but she didn't want to tell him that. He walked to her and untied the knot of the robe, pushing it off her shoulders. There's no need to hide your body from me. She blushed, embarrassed he'd seen through her ruse, but of course he had. He knew her like no one else did. Except maybe Amber. I'm sorry. Don't be, I understand. He took her hand and led her into the living area, doing his best not to stare at her body in the thin nightgown. All he wanted to do was look at her, but he knew she would be embarrassed. He'd have to tread lightly. I got you a chicken club sandwich and French fries. Oh, that sounds good, but we'll have to find the gym to work it off tomorrow. He grinned at her, his gaze meeting hers. I can think of other ways to work it off that will be a lot more fun for both of us. Jessie. She shook her head, not sure if she should be amused or embarrassed by his words. She took a seat on the couch and put her plate in her lap. He sat beside her, picking up his own burger and fries. He talked about their script for the following week as they ate. The scene with Justin is going to be awkward. Justin was the man who played the part of Bob, her foreman. He'd been coming on to Jo for 2 seasons, and she had shut him down time and again. In the show they'd film next, he would bring her a bottle of champagne and try to have a romantic picnic with her. Dylan would interrupt, and there would be sparks between the main characters. The fans really want our characters to just marry already, Valerie said, shaking her head. I know the producers and writers are worried that we'll lose all of our viewers if we don't have the sexual tension anymore, but I think they're wrong. We could have a lot of fun with married characters. He nodded. Yeah. It could be interesting. You act like you don't care. You've always had an opinion about what they write into the show. I wanted them to write a love scene for us, so I could act it out. Now that I get it in real life, I don't need it quite so much. She shook her head at him. What's wrong with you? He shrugged. Nothing that a lifetime making love with you won't fix. You know you don't have to act like you've been thinking about us getting married for a while. I appreciate you giving up your freedom for me. He chuckled. I wouldn't just give up my freedom for anyone without thinking about it long and hard. Do you really think the first time I thought about marrying you was in your trailer this afternoon? She looked at him with wide eyes. Of course it was. You knew I was dating Curtis. I always knew Curtis was the wrong man for you. And you thought you were the right man? He nodded slowly. I knew I was. I just didn't know how to get you to see it. I didn't want to be the one to force you to break it off with him. Really? You didn't think we were right for each other? She hadn't realized others could see so plainly what she'd always known. He shook his head. I'd seen you kiss him. I knew how your face looked after we'd kissed. No, I didn't think you were right for each other. I honestly thought he was mean to you. She sighed. He was. I didn't know how to break it off, though. When did you start dating him? He realized then he didn't know how she'd ended up with the man to begin with. He'd always known they were badly mismatched, but she must have seen something in him at one point. High school. I've known him my whole life. That doesn't mean you have to stay with him. I've been trying to break it off for a while, but every time I tried, he'd start throwing things or threatening me. I didn't know what to do. As soon as the words were out, she regretted them. She'd never meant to tell him so much about her failed relationship with Curtis. Jesse put his empty plate down and turned to her. Why didn't you tell me? You know I'd have helped you. Valerie nodded. I did know, but I knew he hated you more than anyone else on the planet, so I didn't think it would be a good idea. Well, I'm glad you're free of him now. She set her plate on top of his, turning to him fully. Me too. He reached out to her, pulling her against his side, her head on his shoulder. His left hand stroked up and down her arm as he just cuddled her close. Would you have married me today if not for the worry about what the tabloids would print? She thought about his question for a long moment and finally shook her head. No, I don't think I would have. It's not that I don't care about you. You know I do. I wouldn't have tied you to me forever, though. I called a couple of the tabloid rags while you were bathing. Told them we're married. I'm sure our news will hit well before his does. Really? She didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. She was sick of being laughed at for her morals. He nodded. I even sent them a picture of the marriage certificate. There will be no doubt in anyone's mind who broke up with whom and why. She let out a sigh of relief. She hadn't even realized she was still so worried about it, but she was. Thank you. I would do anything for you. Let's go to bed, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. As nervous as she was about the first time, he deserved it. He'd come to her rescue in more ways than one that day, and it was the only way she knew of to thank him for what he'd done. He stood, taking her hand and helping her to her feet before leading her to the bedroom. His palm was sweaty. He couldn't believe how nervous he was. Was it because it was her first time? Or just because it was her? Valerie had filled his thoughts since their addition together more than 4 years before. They stood together at the foot of the bed, and he reached out to her, pulling her to him by the shoulders. One of his hands went to her chin, and he tipped her face up to his. He slowly lowered his lips to hers, his tongue carefully tracing the outline of her bottom lip. Valerie felt as if her heart was about to pound right out of her chest. She felt so much for this man, but was it all physical? What was she doing standing here in front of him in just a nightgown, about to get into bed with him, when she wasn't sure what she felt for him? They may be married, but was it right for her to have sex with a man she didn't love? She clung to his shoulders as he kissed her, wanting more than just a physical relationship with him. Could they build love on a foundation of sexual desire? Pulling back, she stared up into his eyes. I don't want to make you angry, but I don't think I can do this just yet. Jesse closed his eyes, trying to rein in his turbulent emotions. He was so aroused, he wanted nothing more than to make love with her, but not if she didn't feel ready. Do you want to wait? He had to force the words out, around a closed throat. Please say, no. Would you hate me if I said yes? He shook his head. No, of course not. If you don't think we're ready for this, we should wait. He wanted to kick himself for his words, but he knew it was the right thing for her. She'd been raised differently than anyone he knew, and her morals wouldn't be compromised for anyone. Really? You're not mad? She couldn't bear it if he was upset with her. He smiled, leaning down and kissing her once more. I'm not mad. A little disappointed maybe, but I'm not going to rush you. We have the rest of our lives. When it feels right, it'll happen. He shrugged. Well, I thought it felt right 4 years ago, but you didn't. But soon you'll think it's right too. You're more sure of me than I am. She wrapped both arms around his waist and clung to him. What did I ever do to deserve someone as understanding as you are in my life? He chuckled softly. I don't know, you have to have done something good. She made a face at him. It's after midnight. Which means it's after 2 in the morning Texas time. No wonder I'm so tired. She looked at the bed and frowned. Do you want me to sleep on the couch? He shook his head. No need. It's a big bed. He stepped back and unbuttoned his shirt. She watched him remove his shirt with her eyes wide. She'd seen him without a shirt on dozens of times, because they'd had to film scenes with him working that way more than once in the past. It was just so intimate now. When she realized he was watching her watch him, she rushed to the bed and slid under the covers. Are you sure you want to share? It won't bother you? He laughed. You've bothered me since the day we met, but it won't bother me any more than kissing you for the show every week does. Besides, if we're sleeping together, I have a better chance of convincing you that we're meant to be together, and talking you into everything else I want to do to you. He watched her hide from him under the covers as he threw his shirt to the floor and unbuttoned his pants. He wouldn't strip all the way, but he wasn't about to sleep in his pants to avoid offending her. When he was wearing just his underwear, he slipped into bed beside her, reaching out a hand to shut off the lamp before pulling her against him. At first she resisted, feeling like it was wrong to be touching him when he wore nothing, but she reminded herself that it was Jessie and relaxed against him. You're so warm. He smiled, kissing the top of her head. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right now it's good. She snuggled a bit closer, feeling his heat seep through her body. I think I like this. I know I do. He tilted her chin up and kissed her one last time. Good night, Valerie. I love you. He couldn't say the words that were on the tip of his tongue. He couldn't make her feel like she needed to say them back, when he knew she hadn't had enough time away from Curtis to have any idea of her feelings for him. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling safe for the first time in years. Good night, Jessie. Thank you. He hated that she thanked him for manipulating her into doing what he wanted. Gathering her closer, he closed his eyes, thankful to finally have her sleeping in his arms, even if he was going to be uncomfortable. Valerie woke slowly, feeling something heavy weighing her down. She was lying on her side, facing a wall, and her eyes slowly focused on the room around her. She felt no panic, used to waking up in strange places. After a moment it hit her. She was in a hotel room in Vegas. And she was married to Jesse Savoy, the man who set her body on fire. Glancing down, she saw his arm around her, and she snuggled backward. He had wrapped his entire body around her tiny frame. She wiggled a little, feeling him pull her even closer against him. She could feel his bare chest against her shoulders, and something was poking against her bottom, but she refused to think about that. Why did it feel so safe to be with him this way? She knew any other man would have had her feeling more than a little frightened in the same situation. She trusted Jesse, though. He wouldn't hurt her. She slowly rolled over so she could see his face. She'd never seen him sleeping and wondered how he'd look. When she turned to him, she saw that his eyes were wide open and staring into hers. "Good morning," she whispered, embarrassed. His lazy grin transformed his face. "Good morning." His hand came up to cup her cheek as his lips sought hers. After a lazy, tongue-tangling kiss, he stroked her hair away from her face. "Do you want to explore Vegas today?" She shrugged. "I've been before. It's not my favorite place in the world." She truly didn't care what they did as long as she got to spend time with him and get to know him better as they explored their new relationship. "So what do you want to do today?" he asked, his hand drifting down her side. She blushed. "Well, how would you feel about staying in and maybe watching some movies? Or we could go to a show. I heard the magic show at the Rio is good." "Staying in and watching movies sounds good to me." Valerie smiled, glad they could come to an agreement so quickly. It was new for her to have a say in what she did. "I'd like that." I'm sure we can watch something on TV, or we can watch Netflix or Amazon Video on your iPad. Jessie kissed her softly. I don't care what we do, as long as we do it together. Are you real? She asked softly. When are you going to turn into a monster and start yelling at me? He shook his head. Never. I mean, I'm sure we'll fight on occasion, but hopefully it will be a long time in coming. I really hope so. She sat up, dragging the covers to her shoulders. She was more embarrassed about being in just a nightgown with him during the light of day. He watched her for a moment, a grin on his face, before he moved to sit beside her, his back against the headboard of the bed. Do you want to go to Coney Island at New York maybe? She shook her head. No, you really just want to stay in? He'd never known a woman who didn't want to go out all the time. You always wanted to go out with Curtis. She shrugged. He's been strange. I was afraid to be alone with him. She looked down at her hands, embarrassed to admit it. Why didn't you talk to me about it? You know I'd have been there for you. He hated she'd gone through a hard time alone. Her eyes met his. I did know that. The problem was, I wanted to be there for myself. Sometimes I need to find the strength from inside me, not from others. Does that make any sense at all? Like that episode where you had to save me? Instead of me always saving you? Yes. Exactly like that. I need to be more like Joe in real life. Not always relying on others to take care of me and get me out of tight spots. He sighed. He didn't ever hit you, did he? She averted her eyes, unwilling to admit Curtis had hit her, but also unwilling to lie to him. She was ashamed to have stayed in the relationship for as long as she had. What did that sort of weakness say about her character? If you want to leave and check out Coney Island, I'm willing. Her change of subject made him sad, because it told him everything he didn't want to know. He wished Curtis was within reach right then, so he could strangle the man. Not at all. I would like to go out shopping for a ring for you, but that's the only reason we need to leave at all. And that can wait till we get back to Texas if you want. She shrugged. I would like to have a ring. She was glad he wasn't pressing her more on the subject of Curtis. He put his arm around her shoulders and kissed the top of her head. Sounds good to me. Why don't you order breakfast for us while I shower, and then we'll head out after we eat, and I'll buy you the prettiest ring we can find. I'd like that. Valerie waited a moment before her eyes met his. You're pretty awesome, you know. Jessie smiled. I know that I have the most beautiful woman in the world beside me. If that doesn't make me seem awesome, nothing will. He got out of bed then, grabbing his phone from the nightstand on his way to the bathroom. He stopped at the door and turned back to her, surprised to find her eyes glued to him. Were you staring at my butt? She blushed, averting her eyes. I wouldn't. You were. Well, now I know you like my body. This is a step in the right direction. He left the room, closing the door behind him. Valerie buried her face in her hands. His bottom had looked so good in the boxer briefs he was wearing, she hadn't been able to take her eyes off it. She let out a giggle. She certainly wasn't frigid, no matter how many times people told her she was. An hour and a half later, they'd had breakfast, and were in a taxi, heading to a jewelry store. Thankfully, the driver didn't recognize them, and they were able to talk freely in the back seat while they drove. Valerie didn't mind being recognized on occasion, but she got tired of people fawning over them. It was always worse when they were together. When they got to the jewelry store, he paid for the cab while she went inside. She started to look in the jewelry case, glad there were no price tags. She didn't want to think about what he was paying for her ring. He came in a moment later and joined her, pointing out one he liked. What size ring do you wear? He lifted her hand in his, staring at it. She was so tiny. How could anyone ever want to hurt her? He wanted to protect her as much as he wanted to make love with her. She wanted to hide her hands. They were so tiny, she was almost embarrassed to answer him. 4. The man behind the counter frowned. I'll have to have one size down. I don't carry them so small. Jessie looked at him. How long will that take? He'd not realized how desperately he wanted her wearing his ring until that moment. Oh, I can have it done in under an hour. Valerie nodded. That's not terrible. Will you try the one I like? Jessie asked, his eyes on her face. Of course. She waited while the jeweler took the ring from the display, and Jessie slid it onto her finger. It was much too large, of course, but it was beautiful. Are those emeralds? She asked, referring to the stones on the sides of the ring. Yes, ma'am, and may I say they match your eyes perfectly. Valerie looked at Jessie. I really like it. What do you think? Jessie looked from the ring to his wife and back again. I think that's the one. Do you want to try on any others before we have it sized? There was a commotion at the door as a reporter with a microphone and a cameraman walked into the store. Valerie Dobson is here with Jessie Savoy looking at what appears to be an engagement ring. Would you like to comment on that? She held the microphone out to Valerie. Valerie smiled at Jessie, giving him the look that she usually reserved for when the script called for a smoldering glance, knowing it would make for good press. Yes, I would. But first, you need to know my name is Valerie Savoy. Jessie grinned at her, proud of her for her calmness. When he'd called the local news station, he'd worried she would panic. She always got so nervous before interviews. The newswoman's eyes widened. So you're not here looking for engagement rings? The wedding has already happened? She held the microphone out to Jessie. We were married in a private ceremony here in Vegas last night. We decided we couldn't wait another minute. He grinned down at Valerie as he said the words. Valerie reached for Jessie's hand and leaned against him, adding, we couldn't be happier. I never thought I'd get to marry my dream man, and here I am, married to the most wonderful man on earth. So, the rumors that your former boyfriend broke up with you because you wouldn't sleep with him weren't true? Valerie kept her face steady and her smile in place. It's true that I wouldn't sleep with him. But I broke it off. I guess I was holding out for a real man. It was all Jessie could do not to burst out laughing. My wife and I will thank you not to ask questions about our private sex lives. Oh, of course not, the newswoman replied. Will you return to Texas to continue filming Lazy Love this week? Or are you taking an extended honeymoon? We return on Monday, Valerie responded. Every day that I get to work with Jessie is like being on a honeymoon. He makes work fun. Since all of your viewers missed your wedding kiss, maybe you could recreate it for them. Jessie laughed softly. I'll never pass up an opportunity to kiss this incredible woman. He gathered her against him and lowered his head, kissing her with a practiced passion. Valerie wrapped her arms around his shoulders and kissed him back, her fingers winding through his hair, giving the best show she could. She was used to kissing Jessie on camera, and she could make it realistic. It only took a moment for the acting to become real. When Jessie finally lifted his head, the twinkle in his eyes had her mesmerized. She felt the familiar river of passion flowing through her body. She put her hand to his cheek, forgetting the camera was still there. Jessie's eyes didn't leave hers. Good enough? He asked the newswoman. I'm sure every television in the Las Vegas area will be shorting out when we air this tonight. The newswoman quickly stated her name and her channel, before signaling the cameraman to end the recording. Congratulations. Jessie nodded, still not looking away from Valerie. Thanks. Valerie smiled at the woman. Did you get enough? The woman laughed. That kiss was more than enough. Thanks for your time. After they'd gone, Valerie nudged Jessie. Why didn't you tell me you'd alerted the press where we'd be? He shrugged. I know how nervous you get before interviews. I figured you'd handle it better if it was a surprise. Are you trying to wave a red cape in front of Curtis? She asked, her voice soft. He shook his head. Never even occurred to me. I just wanted our news to break before his. Oh, I'm sure we've accomplished that. Chapter 3. Later that afternoon, Jessie and Valerie sat together on the couch in the hotel, trying to decide what to watch on her iPad. Do you want to watch TV? Or a movie? She asked. He shrugged. I probably won't watch anything but you. He knew he should hold his tongue to avoid overwhelming her, but sometimes, he couldn't resist stating the truth. She blushed, shaking her head. Why do you say things like that? Because they're true. His hand stroked her hair out of her face. I'm glad we're married, you know. You are? She searched his face carefully. She'd never known him to lie, but he was a good actor. He nodded. Of course I am. You're a beautiful, incredible woman. Why wouldn't I be thrilled? She took a deep breath. I guess I'm not used to people acting like I'm worth something. He frowned at her words. Curtis was a slime bag. She sighed. I know he was. I never should have stayed with him so long, but I didn't know how to get away. How'd you end up with him anyway? He knew they'd been together since high school, but he'd never understood why. You know, we went to school together. He was my next-door neighbor, and our moms were friends. We were in the same class of 42 kids. When I didn't have a date for the junior prom, he asked me. I wasn't dating anyone, and we'd known each other forever, so I said yes. We didn't really date through our senior years, but he was always there. We went to senior prom together, and then when we went away to college, we both ended up at the same school. She stared off into space as she answered him, not wanting to relive everything but knowing he needed to know, to understand. We were in the same co-ed dorm, and he watched out for me. Watched out for you, or scared away anyone who wanted to be your friend? Jessie asked, reading her facial expressions. They seemed to go hand in hand with Curtis. She stared down at her hands for a moment, before looking back at him, determined to get through the whole story. We'd go to lunch together. We'd eat dinner together. I didn't know a lot of people at school, because he was always there. People started to assume we were a couple. You weren't? She shook her head. Not really. I mean, I'd go to meals with him as a friend, but he never asked me to be his girlfriend or anything. Okay. He watched her intently, wanting to understand what had happened. Why had this beautiful, intelligent woman ended up with such a slimeball? When we went home for Christmas break after our first semester at college, he told his mom we were dating. Then his mom told my mom. There was much rejoicing, and I didn't feel like I should argue with him. She shrugged. I didn't really want to date him, but I wasn't sure how to get out of it. Everyone at school thought we were dating anyway. So when we got back to school, he started coming over to study every evening. That's when I got involved with theater. I found that if I had rehearsals, I could be with people other than him, and he would leave me alone for a little while. Did he hurt you then? She shook her head. Not physically. He'd threaten me sometimes. He was always there during rehearsals, putting a wall between me and the other actors. He would sit in the audience and do his homework while we rehearsed. You know how big he is. All the guys were afraid of him. I'm not. His words were soft, but she could hear the emotion beneath them. He would always have her back. Valerie smiled at that. I'm glad. I don't think we've seen the last of him. Are you worried he's going to hurt you? She thought about that for a moment, unsure how to respond. As long as you're with me, I'm not afraid. I don't want to be alone. So when we get back to Texas, I'll make sure you're never alone. No hardship there. He waggled his eyebrows at her, making her laugh. I think that's what I like best about you. You can make me laugh. He smiled, stroking her arm and pulling her to his side. Finish your story. How did you end up still dating him when you got to Hollywood 4 years ago? She shrugged. I'm honestly not sure. When we were about to graduate, I said I was moving to Hollywood to pursue a career in acting. I was sure he'd stay in Iowa. His family has run this funeral parlor for generations, and he was always planning to take it over. Funeral parlor? Seems fitting. She shook her head, stifling a giggle. You're bad. You like me when I'm bad. She couldn't respond to that remark, so she continued her story. Anyway, he said he was coming too. His degree was in business, so he said he was going to be my manager. She shuddered. I told him I wouldn't have need of a manager for a very long time. I was sure I'd be waiting tables for years, waiting for my big break. How long were you there before you auditioned for Joe? She laughed. 2 weeks. I think I'd still be waiting tables if we hadn't auditioned together that day. I still watch some of our shows in awe. You have so much raw passion when you act. You make me look good. He shook his head. You really don't get it, do you? Get what? It's not me. Valerie frowned. Well, it's not me. My chemistry with Bob on the show is awful. It's us, Val. Neither of us has what it takes alone. When we're together, everything is pure magic. Jesse pulled her onto his lap, straddling him, knowing he could see into her eyes as he talked to her that way. I heard what you said to Curtis when you were fighting yesterday. He said he could feel the ice forming on your lips when he kissed you, and you said, because I don't have any passion for you, Curtis. Does that mean you feel passion for me? She nodded. I do. I know I shouldn't, but I do. I always have. He cupped her face in his hands. Why shouldn't you? Because it means I'm being unfaithful to Curtis. She shook her head. I should never be unfaithful. Why did she still feel a need to be faithful to a man she'd never had feelings for? Did you ever agree to go out with him? Did you ever agree to let him kiss you? Or did he just do those things, because they were what he wanted? He knew then he could never take the choice from her about anything. She had to be in control of her own destiny, whether he felt like he knew what was right for her or not. She shrugged. He just did them, but I was his girl. Why were you his girl? Did you ever want to be his girl? Or did you just do it because you thought you were supposed to? No, I never had any feelings for him. He made me think, well, he told me I had a heart of ice so often, I believed it. He was always calling me the Ice Queen. It still hurt to think about it. You don't have a heart of ice, Valerie. You are the most passionate woman I know. She looked away, over his shoulder at the wall behind him. Only with you, she mumbled, her voice barely loud enough for him to hear. He gathered her close and simply held on to her. She told him exactly what he needed to hear. She was his, whether she knew it yet or not. When did he start hitting you? She closed her eyes, not wanting to continue her story. Can we talk about something else? He shook his head. Not yet, not until I know everything. I need to be able to protect you. What if I want to be able to protect myself? She never wanted to feel as helpless as she'd felt with Curtis again. Then you need to start carrying a gun. Have you considered a concealed handgun course? We spend most of the year in Texas, and handguns are legal there. I couldn't shoot anyone. Jesse sighed. Then we're back to me protecting you, aren't we? Maybe I could take a self-defense course? Curtis is 6'4". He's a bear of a man. You're barely 5 feet. I don't care how good you become at self-defense. Unless you get a good kick to the balls in, you're not going to be able to protect yourself against him. He pushed her back by her shoulders, looking into her eyes again. Finish the story. The first time he hit me was the day I auditioned for Joe. He was with me, as he always was. Do you remember in the first season when the producers made the rule that no one could be on set during filming? I asked them to. She shook her head. Anyway, he watched our audition. He watched us act together, and then they made us kiss, remember? The kiss hadn't been part of the scene, but they'd needed to see if the two of them had chemistry before they were cast. How could he forget? It was the first time he'd kissed her, and he'd known then he'd never want another woman for as long as he lived. I do remember. He said that everyone could see the passion between us. That after we kissed, you walked away with, she blushed and looked at the wall behind him. He said I walked away with an erection? At her nod, he continued. He was right. Any other woman could dance naked for me, and I wouldn't be as turned on as I get every time I kiss you. I don't care if it's a passionate kiss or just a simple one. I kiss you, and my body is on fire. Hell, I don't even have to kiss you. All I have to do is be in the same room with you, and I'm ready to throw you on the nearest hard surface and make love with you. I don't know what to say to that. Except that he made her feel the same way. She'd left that audition with an unfamiliar tightness in her nipples. She'd been truly aroused for the first time in her life. He hit you because you turned me on? Jessie asked, wanting to hunt the other man down and kill him on the spot. She shook her head. No, he hit me because you turned me on. I was wearing a thin top, and he could see that my nipples were erect. No matter how many times we'd kissed over the years, that had never happened with him. I never lost my breath when I kissed him. I just look at you, and my breathing becomes labored. He hated me for that. You couldn't help your reaction to me any more than you could fake a reaction to him. She shrugged. I told him I only reacted that way because I was acting. That I was good. She laughed. He didn't buy it for even a second. He said no one is that good. Why did you stay with him after he hit you? I didn't know how to get away. I thought about getting a restraining order, but I knew he'd still hurt me. He knows my family. What if he hurts my mom? Or my sister? Jessie closed his eyes. Have you phoned your mom and told her what happened? He was just starting to realize that it wasn't simply the two of them who needed to be protected. She shook her head. It just occurred to me, I've been so wrapped up thinking about you and this new marriage of ours. I should have called her last night. What is wrong with me? Valerie, it's not your job to protect the world. I do think you should call her, though. He reached over and took her phone from the end table, putting it in her hand. Call her. When she went to get off his lap, he put his hands on her thighs, keeping her in place. No, I like having you there. She blushed. I like it too. Too much, I'm afraid. She quickly tapped her mother's name on her phone and put it to her ear. Hey, Mom. Hi, Valerie, how's Texas? Well, actually I'm not in Texas right now. I'm in Vegas. What are you doing in Vegas? You should have let me know. Ricky and I would have met you there. Ricky was Valerie's younger sister. Their dad had left when they were young, and her mother had raised them on her own. Valerie smiled at that. I don't think that would have worked out, Mom. Most people don't take their families on their honeymoons. There was a long pause. You married Curtis? Valerie bit her lip. She didn't want to have to admit to her mother that she'd broken up with her best friend's son. Actually, no. I married Jessie. Your co-star? Really? The excitement in her mother's voice shocked Valerie. Yeah. Does Curtis know? There was fear in her mother's voice. Did she know more than she'd let on? No. I broke up with Curtis, but he didn't know I was marrying Jessie. He called today. Valerie closed her eyes, not wanting to know more, but needing to ask. What did he want? He told me you two had a fight, and he needed to find some way to make it up to you. He asked what your favorite flower is. What did you tell him? I told him that since you'd been dating for 8 years, he should know the answer to that better than I do. There was a pause. I'm glad you broke it off with him. He wasn't good for you. No, he wasn't. How did you know? Her mother's laugh was bitter. Carol told me. His dad was just like him. I didn't know. Valerie was unsure how to respond to that. Her mother had known he was abusive and said nothing to her? There was no way for you to know. We didn't want to come between you, but we've both been watching you when you came home. Worrying he'd hit you. I'm fine, Mom. Did he hit you? Valerie closed her eyes. She wished her mother had asked her that question 4 years before. Maybe she'd have been bolder about getting out of the situation with her mom at her side. I'm a strong woman, Mom. I'll be fine. Her eyes met Jessie's, and she could see the sadness in them. Well, I'm happy you married Jessie. I could see from the moment you two were on my TV screen you were perfect for each other. Valerie smiled at that. He's a good man. I know he is. You can almost touch the emotion between you two. Be careful, Mom. I'm afraid that when Curtis finds out I married, he's going to come after you. Or Ricky. I'm going to go to the police station first thing on Monday morning and take out a restraining order. Thank you. Will Jesse protect you? Yeah, Jesse won't let him hurt me. Jesse took the phone from her hand. Ms. Dobson? This is Jesse. I won't let anything happen to Valerie. You just watch out for yourself. Don't wait to get that restraining order. Go to the police station today. Better yet, come to Texas for a while. We'd love to have you as our guests on the set. Valerie couldn't hear her mother's response. I understand that. Just be careful. Yes, Valerie and I will visit as soon as we get a break in our schedules. He pushed the end button and handed the phone back to her. How worried are you that he'll hurt your family? She shrugged. I'm glad you told her to go to the police station today. I don't think he'll waste his money flying back to Iowa to see them, but you never can tell. He's crazy. Would you feel better if we put off filming for a while to go there and be with them? We can't do that. He shrugged. We're the stars, we can do what we want. It's probably not a good idea, though. I don't want to put the whole show behind schedule. I'm sure Mom will go to the police today. She won't let anything happen to Ricky. How old is Ricky now? 20. And she thinks you're the hottest man on the planet. She asks me every time we talk what it's like to kiss you. She winked at him, letting him know she thought her sister's crush was amusing. Jesse raised an eyebrow. And what do you tell her? That it feels better than chocolate tastes. He grinned. I've seen you with a pint of chocolate ice cream with chocolate syrup on top. There's nothing you like more than chocolate. Valerie leaned forward, bringing their torsos together, and she kissed him. Except kissing you. I could never eat another bite of chocolate, but I think I'd die without your kisses. Now that's some high praise. You make me think you mean it. I do. Truly. I've never meant anything the way I mean this. He grabbed her hips and pulled them into direct contact with his. Groaning, he pulled her head down for another kiss, his tongue making quick work of her mouth. She moved her hands to the hem of his t-shirt, and moved them up under it, rubbing her hands over his bare chest. She wanted nothing more than she wanted to strip him and explore his body, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to do anything beyond that, so she said nothing. He caught the hem of his shirt with his hands and pulled it over his head, releasing her lips just long enough to get it off and onto the floor. Valerie was thrilled to have his entire bare torso to explore with her fingertips, and she tore her lips from his, kissing a path down his shoulder. Jesse leaned his head back on the couch and held her lightly by the hips, not making any moves to frighten her, but enjoying her touch. You make me feel so powerless. She touched her tongue to his bare shoulder, tasting the saltiness of his skin. Powerless? He nodded. Every time you touch me, my legs go weak. I want you with everything inside of me, and I love every second of it. She smiled at that. You've got an amazing body. He wasn't nearly as tall as Curtis, but his body was pure muscle. She loved to touch him. I like how you taste. She touched her tongue to him again, swirling it around against his skin. You're killing me, Val. I want to drag you off to bed and make love to you until neither of us can ever move again. She froze at his words, sitting up straight on his lap. I'm not ready for that. I know you're not. He groaned, pushing her off his lap and onto the couch beside him. That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. I've heard that somewhere. She nodded. My mom used to tell me that all the time. I'm going to be stronger than Superman by the time this weekend is over. I guess we'll fly back under your own power instead of using a plane? What time will we get back? He grinned. We need to be at the airport by 2. We land around 9. I hate that we're losing time when we get home. She rubbed the back of her neck. Are you going to hate me if I'm still Valerie the Virgin when we get home? Not at all. I'd rather no one knew you were still a virgin, of course, but with your history, I can understand your hesitation. It doesn't bother you? Jessie grinned ruefully. Does it bother me that my wife is too afraid of sex for me to make love to her? Sure, it bothers me. But I'll take it as slow as you need me to take it. I understand that you haven't been treated as you should have been. We have a kissing scene to film on Monday morning. We're going to be steaming up the cameras this time. He shook his head. That will thrill everyone, but I'm not sure they'll notice a difference. I'm sure the producers are worried that we're going to lose some of the magic that's between us when our sexual tension is appeased. Do you think we will? He shook his head. No, because I don't think I could ever get enough of you. You're something else, Valerie Dobson. It's not Dobson anymore. It's Valerie Savoy now, remember? He grinned at that. You're not really going to change your name, are you? I don't think you have any idea how old-fashioned I really am. I believe that women take their husbands' names when they marry. I believe in children being raised by their parents, not by nannies. Yes, I'm changing my name. I want your last name on the credits beside my first name. He smiled. I want that too. She looked at him curiously. With all the years they'd known one another, he'd never mentioned his family to her. Tell me about your last name. What was your father like? He shrugged. I don't know. My parents were killed in a car wreck when I was an infant. I was raised by an elderly aunt, who didn't much care about me, to be honest. I had no idea. She was shocked that she hadn't bothered to get to know her friend well enough to know that about him. Why didn't I ever ask you that before? You know everything important about me. I do? Valerie had no idea what he was talking about. What did she know about him that was important? What's my favorite color? Green. My favorite movie? Star Wars. See? You know important stuff. The past means nothing. You know who I am today. What's your favorite song? She asked, wanting to know as much about him as possible. They were friends, but she was discovering there was a great deal more to know about him. You won't laugh? She shook her head, surprised at the question. Why would I laugh at your favorite song? Well, it's kind of sappy. I'm a sappy kind of girl. Don't Take the Girl by Tim McGraw. She grinned. I love that song. It is kind of sappy, though. But you don't think I'm sappy, do you? I mean, you know I'm a manly man, who only likes the song for its strong beat, and it has nothing to do with the sappy lyrics. He winked at her, and she nodded. Oh, of course. You would never be sappy. You're too manly for that. He sighed, nodding. You know me well. Valerie nodded. I'm your wife. How could I not? As it should be. Chapter 4. After they got back to the set the following evening, Jessie carried Valerie's suitcase into her trailer for her. They lived in trailers on the lot for 3 weeks, took a week off and went where they wanted, and then came back for more. Once he'd set the suitcase down, she looked around. We haven't talked about living arrangements. He shrugged. Your trailer or mine? I'm not living apart. She smiled at his words and nodded. That's my thought. I've gotten used to you snoring in my ear. He caught her hand and pulled her close, leaning down to kiss her. I don't snore. I breathe loudly. She snickered at that, clinging to him. Uh-huh. And you don't sweat either. You glisten, right? Like a pig. There was a loud knock on the door to her trailer, and she jumped away from him guiltily. He grabbed her hand and pulled her right back into his arms. Come in. The director of the episode they were working on, Stephen, opened the door and walked into the trailer. Well, it looks like you two haven't lost the sexual tension. Jessie grinned. I don't think that'll ever happen. Do you? Stephen shook his head, laughing. I just had to see for myself. You both moving in here? I think so, Valerie answered. We might end up using mine to live in and his for storage. Who knows? Whatever you two decide. I want my name changed in the credits. It's Savoy now. Stephen grinned at that. Really? You're taking his name? You know actresses never take their husbands' names when they marry, right? I'm not anyone but me. And my name is now Valerie Savoy, and I'm kind of proud of the name. I'll talk to the powers that be. Maybe for the first episode with the new name we can put a heart around it or something cutesy like that. The fans'll eat it up with a spoon. Jessie smiled at that. Get us some extra publicity for the marriage, would you? We need to do the talk show circuit and do everything we can to show we're not ashamed. Stephen frowned at that. Curtis causing trouble? Jessie shrugged. He had talked to Stephen while they were still in Vegas, warning him to be on the lookout for the other man. Not yet. News just really leaked last night though. I saw the Vegas news segment. It's had thousands of views on YouTube, and your marriage was trending on Twitter this morning. Have either of you made an official announcement to your fans? Valerie shook her head. I haven't. I didn't even think of that. She reached for her phone. Doing it now. She thought for a moment about how to say it before quickly tapping the keys with her thumbs. At Jessie Savoy, love your last name so much that I made it mine. Thanks for sharing it and your life with me. #got married. She set her phone back down and ignored the constant beeps coming from it. I think I may need to shut Twitter notifications off for a while. The fans are going to go insane. Jessie reached for his phone to see how she'd said it and read her words with a grin. He pushed reply and tapped in a response. At Valerie Dobson, there's no one else who I would welcome into my life and my arms so willingly. Glad you're mine. #got married too. He set his phone down as it started pinging at him. Mine too, I guess. He grinned at her. Great tweet, by the way. Stephen looked back and forth between them before clearing his throat. I'll leave you newlyweds alone, and go tell the publicity people to get talking this up. They're going to be so excited to have some real news for the fans. Valerie watched him go with a grin before moving closer to Jessie, her hand on his chest. How did you respond? Oh, you know. I said all the right mushy lovey-dovey stuff that the fans will love. All of it true, by the way, but if you tell anyone that, I'll deny it to my last breath. Oh, of course. Because you're a manly man and not a sap. I won't forget that. I'm glad. It's important people understand the manliness that drives me. It is. He backed her up against the wall, his hands going to her waist as he leaned down to allow his mouth to plunder hers. We need to open the windows, and you need to moan a lot. The whole cast and crew need to know what a good lover I am. She laughed at that. So you want me to fake it, huh? If Meg Ryan can fake it, why can't you? You're a better actor than she is. You only say that because you're trying to get in my pants. Jessie nodded. Of course. I don't even deny it. Soon. He took a deep breath. When you're ready. Why are you being so patient with me? I don't deserve it. Yes, you do. You're the most incredible woman I've ever met in my life. You need to open your eyes and see what everyone else in the world sees when they look at you. Which is, now you're just fishing for compliments. Jessie shook his head, taking her hand and leading her to the full-length mirror on her wall. Look at yourself. You have beautiful hair. I want to spend all my time running my fingers through it. Your body is perfect. I wouldn't complain even a bit if you stripped for me right now. He stopped and watched her for a moment. Well, what? Aren't you going to strip for me, so I can prove my point? Valerie laughed. Good try. I thought so. He moved behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Look at us together. Millions of people in this country daydream about the two of us getting married, because we have so much chemistry between us. She sighed, leaning back against him. She was getting used to feeling his erections pressing against her, but they never failed to make her heart beat faster. You make me feel like I'm someone special. You are. I've never cared for anyone the way I care about you, Val. I hope you know how fabulous you really are. He'd almost told her he loved her, but he'd caught himself just in time. She wasn't ready for the words yet. She wasn't ready to know that he'd fallen in love with her at their first kiss, that he'd been celibate for 4 years, dreaming of her every night. No, Valerie wasn't nearly ready for that knowledge. So he would do what he'd done for the entire time he'd known her, and bide his time. He could wait forever, now that he knew she was his. She sighed. You're too good for me. He spun her in his arms, taking her lips with his. I believe the opposite is true. Men all over the world are going to envy me. She laughed. I expect to get hate mail from women who were convinced you were saving yourself for them. He chuckled. Nope. Just saving myself for you. Yeah, right. She rolled her eyes at that. She may have never seen him with a woman, but she was certain he'd had them in his life. No more, though, okay? No more what? He'd lost her somewhere along the way. Valerie frowned. No more women. I'll do my best to get over my insecurities, but promise you won't cheat on me before then. I've waited 4 years for you. What's a little more? Like you haven't had a woman in your life for 4 years. You're crazy if you expect me to believe that. He said nothing else about it. He hadn't even kissed another woman since he'd first met her at the audition. He'd been dating someone at the time, but he'd let her know that it was over between them. They hadn't been serious anyway. She yawned. We need to get some sleep. We have to be up early tomorrow. It's going to be a long day of filming. I don't know if I'm going to be able to watch that scene between you and Bob. I married you, not him. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. I'm going to go get ready for bed. She went into her small bathroom, closing the door firmly behind her. He walked to the bedroom at the end of the trailer, looking at the queen-sized bed. It was smaller than the king they'd used in Vegas, but he didn't see that it made any difference. They'd spent every night completely entwined in each other's limbs anyway. A smaller bed would just make it easier to stay that close. He stripped down to his boxer briefs as he waited for his turn in the bathroom. He'd be happy once they could get back to Los Angeles, and she could move into his big house. There would be no waiting for bathrooms there. They had another 2 weeks of filming on their schedule before they would be able to go back though. He set it as his goal to wait to make love with her until he could do so in his own bed, in the home they'd share with one another. He wasn't sure he could hold out that long. If she indicated she was ready in any way, he knew he would be all over her. He liked to think he had more discipline than that, but when it came down to it, he knew that she was his entire world. When she came out of the bathroom in her shorts and t-shirt, he was sitting on the edge of the bed. She walked to him and stood between his spread legs. I sure do like seeing you in my bed at night. I'd rather feel you in your bed at night, he said, waiting for her blush. It came just as he'd expected. Do you think we'll ever get to the point that you'll stop blushing at everything I say? She shook her head. Of course not. I'm going to be an old lady sitting with 4 grandkids on my lap, and you're going to wink at me from across the room, and I'm going to blush. Grandkids? That means you plan to have kids someday, which means we'll eventually have sex. Right? She made a face at him. You know we will. I just need a little more time. He nodded. Think you'll be ready by the time we get back to LA? She thought about it for a moment. She didn't want to make a promise that she couldn't keep, but with the passion between them, she knew it would be all she could do to hold out that long. Maybe by then, she wouldn't feel like she was doing something wrong by making love with him. I think I will. He drew her close. Let's plan for that then. I'll take you out on a nice romantic date, and we'll let things happen. She nodded. I like that idea. Have you thought at all about moving to my place? Do you have someone you could call to get things moved over now? My agent would take care of it. I'll call her in the morning. I like the idea of your clothes living in the closet with mine. You really are a manly sap, aren't you? I never once denied it. Just remember to keep the word manly in there, and we're all good. She leaned down just the slightest bit to kiss him. I like being the only one who knows what a sap you really are. He chuckled. I think every fan of the show knows. They see how I look at you. They think you're just acting. No manly man like you could be that sappy in real life. He tugged her down to the bed, and pushed her to her back, looming over her. What exactly are you trying to say? She giggled. Nothing. Nothing at all. His hands went under the edges of her t-shirt to her bare abdomen, fingers poised to tickle her. I think you'd better tell me, or suffer the consequences. A gasp escaped her lips at the feel of his fingers against her bare skin. Her hands had been under his shirt many times, but him touching her that way was something else entirely. Her heart started racing. You don't scare me, you know. The fingers that were ready to tickle caressed instead. I'm so glad to hear that. He lowered his lips to hers, kissing her softly. I don't ever want to scare you. I think maybe that's why you don't. I know you wouldn't hurt me for anything. I'd take a bullet for you. Oh, Jess. Her hands wound through his hair and she pulled him down for another kiss, one in which she was the aggressor. They'd filmed a few scenes where she'd all but attacked him physically, grabbing him and kissing him, but this was the first time she'd been the aggressor for real. Her hands roamed over his back, and down, touching the bottom she'd admired so much through his underwear. What is it about you that makes me feel so much? His hands moved up further under her shirt, one of them cupping her breast for the first time. He'd always been careful to keep his hands in places that wouldn't upset her. But he wanted more. She moaned softly under his hands. That feels so good. Then his mouth was back on hers, and he was kissing her again, his lips more insistent against her. He caught her nipple between his thumb and forefinger, gently squeezing it. She gasped under his touch, her mouth frantically moving with his. She felt an aching tenseness in her abdomen that she'd never felt before. One of her legs wrapped around his, stroking up and down him frantically. He lifted his head for a moment, looking into her eyes. When he saw nothing but passion there, he pulled her shirt up and tossed it to the floor, lowering his head back to hers. He'd said they'd wait, but he didn't want to wait. He wanted to make love to her. Valerie arched her body underneath his, silently begging for his touch on her breasts again. She wanted him to touch her everywhere. He leaned down, catching her nipple between his lips, stroking it with his tongue, while one hand skimmed down her side. He didn't want to scare her, but he'd take this just as far as she let him. He brought his knee up to stroke her core, through the sleep shorts she wore. At her gasp, he grinned. You like that? She nodded, her face flushed. I like everything with you. He moved back up so his lips were against hers, keeping one hand toying with her breasts, one of which was still moist from his mouth. Do you need me to stop? He whispered. She shook her head. Not yet. He swallowed hard. The yet bothered him. Hopefully she wouldn't ask him to stop at all, but if she did, he would comply, even if it killed him. He wouldn't ever force something on her she didn't want. Her hands moved over his back, and before she thought about it, they'd slid inside his underwear to cup his bottom in her hands. He lifted his head in surprise, never having expected her to willingly touch him there. Feeling bold? I guess I am. Do you mind? Her eyes searched his face, trying to make sure she wasn't doing something he'd consider out of line. Mind? You can touch me anywhere you want, anytime you want. She grinned. Sounds like fun. Oh, it will be. He lowered his head again, capturing her lips, his hands more insistent on her breasts. Slowly he ran one hand down her bare stomach, inside her shorts, to the juncture of her thighs, stroking her lightly, waiting for her hands against his shoulders, to push him away. When it didn't happen, he moved his thumb to the nub of pleasure there. She gasped when he touched her, but didn't stop him. It felt too good. She writhed beneath him on the bed, wanting so much more. She dug her hands into his bottom, which she was still clutching, pulling him closer to her, and feeling his erection pressing against her hip. It excited her to know he felt so much for her. She moved one hand around from the back of his underwear to the front, gripping him in her fist. He felt awed to her inexperienced touch. "Your skin is so soft," she whispered. Jessie took deep gulping breaths of air, trying to maintain his resolve to take things slowly with her. His thumb picked up speed as it rubbed against her pleasure button. When he felt her thumb stroke over the tip of him, spreading the moisture that was already there, he groaned. "You should probably stop that." "Why?" "You said I could touch you anywhere I wanted." Her words were punctuated by gasps of pleasure as his thumb continued to move against her. "If you keep it up, I'm not sure I'll be able to stop," he confessed, punctuating his words with a hard kiss on her lips. "Do we have to stop?" she asked softly. He lifted his head, staring down into her eyes. "Don't you want to?" She shook her head. "No. I want to feel you inside me, Jessie. I want to be your wife. Really your wife. Are you sure?" He hated questioning her, because he wanted to just make her his, but he had to make certain she was ready for him. He couldn't bear it if he made love to her, and she regretted it later. "I'm positive. Please make love to me." He read her feelings on her face and finally nodded, moving to his knees to strip her shorts down her body. When she was bare beneath him, he paused for a moment, just to look at her. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known." Her hands reached for him, but he put her off for another moment while he stripped off his underwear, dropping them to the floor beside the bed. Rolling between her spread thighs, he ran his hands up and down her body, trying to make certain she was truly ready for him. "I don't want to hurt you." "You couldn't hurt me." He swallowed, fighting for control. "I know I will, just a little." "I don't want to, but it's your first time. You're going to hurt me more if you don't." She brushed the lock of hair that had fallen onto his forehead away tenderly. He grinned, staring down at her. "You amaze me sometimes." Valerie shook her head. "You're the amazing one. You put up with all my insecurities and still manage to make me feel like I'm someone special. I don't know what I've ever done to deserve you." He stroked her cheek before lowering his head to kiss her sweetly as he reached down to guide himself to her entrance. With one quick stroke, he was inside her and buried to the hilt, his hands stroking her insistently, praying she was all right with what they were doing. He raised his head, half afraid to see pain on her face, but instead, he only saw wonder. "You okay?" She nodded. "It feels strange, but good. It's only going to get better from here." His mouth was back on hers, kissing her as his hands continued to stroke her to a higher level of passion. He moved within her, closing his eyes to try to control himself and take things slowly. He didn't dare go too quickly and hurt her. It didn't take long before she was writhing beneath him, and when she arched up against him in pleasure, he followed her into oblivion. Rolling to her side, he gathered her against him, holding her tightly. Valerie clung to Jessie, still short of breath. Resting her head on his chest, she couldn't stop touching him, her hands constantly stroking. "Why didn't we do that 2 days ago?" she finally asked, when she could speak again. He laughed. "You weren't ready." He kissed her softly. "I'm so glad you're ready now." I don't know about now, but give me a little bit," she said with a wicked glint in her eye. He reached out and flicked off the light in the bedroom, plunging them into darkness. "Just sleep for now. Tomorrow's another day." "Jessie?" "Yeah?" "You make me feel things I never imagined I could." "Thank you." He didn't know quite how to respond to that. "I should be thanking you. You just made me feel things I always knew I would feel if we ever made love. All of my dreams have just come true." Her soft breathing told him she was asleep. He wondered if she'd even heard him. "I love you," he whispered softly, knowing she wouldn't hear that. When she was ready, he'd tell her again and again for the rest of their lives. Chapter 5. Valerie woke to unfamiliar aches the following morning, wrinkling her nose at the alarm on her phone. She opened her eyes to see Jessie shutting it off for her. "Morning," she mumbled, averting her eyes. He caught her chin in his hand and kissed her. "Morning. We have an hour before we need to be on the set for hair and makeup." He wanted to spend the entire day in bed with her, making sweet love, but he knew she wasn't ready for that. Besides, he could just imagine Stephen's reaction to them taking the day off for lovemaking. She groaned. I want to sleep for the rest of the day. She rubbed her cheek against his shoulder, closing her eyes again. He laughed. I never knew you weren't a morning person. By the time I see you, you're always peppy and ready to go. You always see me after my second cup of coffee. I see. Well, why don't I make coffee while you shower? He couldn't help but be amused by her grumpiness. She reminded him of a sleepy kitten. She nodded. Sounds good. She rolled to the edge of the bed, taking all the covers with her as she held them tightly around her body. Hey. It's cold. She shrugged. Got a shower. She took every cover from the bed into the bathroom with her, leaving him with nothing. He lay there for a moment, watching her and chuckling. She'd eventually get over her embarrassment, and then he didn't know what he'd do. Seeing more of her body on a regular basis would keep him in a constant state of arousal. He grabbed her phone on the way to the tiny kitchen to start the coffee pot. He quickly dialed her mother's number, worried a bit about whether or not she'd followed through on getting the restraining order. Hello? Hi, this is Jessie. Oh, good. I was hoping it was you. He called 5 times yesterday. Jessie sighed. I was afraid of that. Did you get the restraining order? He absently wondered how Valerie would feel about hiring bodyguards for her mother and sister for a while. Yeah, and I blocked his number on my phone now. Good. What about his mother? Does she know? This is big news, Jessie. The whole planet seems to know. Jessie scooped coffee into the coffee maker and added water before switching it on. Has she said anything? Yeah, she told me she's glad Valerie married you, and she's away from Curtis. Good. Let me know if he comes around. I will. What's your direct number? I'm guessing you want to keep Valerie out of this. I do. She has enough on her mind. She's really worried about you and Ricky. I know she is. She's always worried about others more than she should. Jessie poured a cup of coffee, knowing Valerie would be out any minute, so he had to finish the call quickly. Let me hire a couple of bodyguards for you and Ricky. It would make me feel a lot safer. There was a long pause before the answer came. I won't live my life in fear. I don't think he'll come after us. It was the answer he'd expected. Jessie gave her his number and made her promise to call if there were any more problems, before putting the phone down. Valerie came into the kitchen, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, reaching out for the cup of coffee in his hand. She took a deep swallow and sighed. Thanks. You weren't this bad about mornings over the weekend. I didn't have to wake to an alarm over the weekend. I woke up when I wanted to wake up. She sat down at the table, feeling the caffeine whizzing through her system and the grumpiness slowly abating. He noticed she still hadn't met his gaze. Are you regretting making love last night? She shook her head. Not at all. Well, I'm not sure how to act with a man I've made love with. It's a new experience for me. He cupped her chin in his hand, lifting her eyes to his. The same way you've always acted. But think about how good it feels throughout the day. I'm not going to be able to not think about it with as sore as I am. She wasn't complaining. She liked the constant reminder of making love with him. I'm sorry, he said with a frown. Are you going to be able to work? She raised an eyebrow. I've worked sick more times than I can count. I can work through stiffness. I always tend to work through stiffness when you're around. He winked at her, watching her face as she caught the joke. It took her a minute to get his meaning, and she blushed. You're bad. And you like it. He saw her coffee mug was empty and poured her another. I'm going to shower while you finish drinking your coffee. I'd rather walk to wardrobe together. You're worried he's going to come here and try to hurt me, aren't you? Her brown eyes were steady on his as she frowned, thinking about the position they were both in. I wouldn't put anything past him at this point. We're going to be safe. She drank the coffee, trying not to worry too much. While she waited, she read over her lines for the day one last time. The The scene with Bob wasn't one she really wanted to do. Bob would kiss her, and she had to push him away, and then there was a fight scene with Dylan. When Jessie was done with the shower and dressed, he walked over to wardrobe with her, holding her hand. As they gave her the clothes they needed her to wear and fixed her makeup, Jennifer, their makeup artist, nodded to her hand. "You can't wear that." Valerie looked down at her wedding ring with a frown. She didn't want to take it off for the show, but she understood she'd need to. "I know." She carefully took it off and put it on her vanity table. Jessie was soon dressed in his jeans and button-up shirt for the day. They always put him in cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. Her gaze moved up and down him. "Looking good." He grinned. "Just remember I'm the one you care about, not Bob." She laughed. "Joe and I are in agreement. Neither of us want Bob. We're all about you and Dylan." Jennifer grinned. "I'm so glad you two finally quit being stupid and got married." "Quit being stupid?" Valerie asked, gaping at Jennifer. "What's that supposed to mean?" The makeup artist had never had much of an opinion about her relationship with Jessie before. "It means that Jessie's been in love with you since day one. It's about time he acted on it." Jennifer looked at Valerie as if she was stupid for not knowing. Valerie blinked a couple of times. "He has not. We've been friends." She looked at Jessie. "Tell her." Jessie stayed silent for a moment, looking at her. "I like the way that dress looks on you." Jennifer said nothing more, but her knowing eyes moved from Jessie to Valerie and back again. After they were finished getting ready, Valerie and Jessie walked to the main house together where they'd have a quick scene before her picnic with Bob. "Jessie? Why didn't you agree with me back there?" "Val, I couldn't." "Don't worry about it." "What do you mean you couldn't? You couldn't tell her you weren't in love with me?" He stopped walking and caught her arm, knowing it would put them a bit behind schedule, but needing her to understand. "I'm not going to lie to you. I fell in love with you at first sight. Everyone knew it but you." "What?" She stared at him in shock, feeling betrayed. How could he have loved her so long without telling her? "Why didn't you ever say anything? More importantly, why didn't I notice? When was I supposed to say something? You were dating Curtis. Everyone knew it." She bit her lip. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say." "There's nothing to say. Just accept it and move on." He took her hand again and walked her to the house, feeling inexplicably hurt. He'd wanted her to tell him that she loved him too. He knew she couldn't, but that didn't change how he felt. Her mind raced as they walked. Could it be true that he'd loved her for so long? How was that possible when she hadn't even known? Her mind wasn't on her scene with him, and she messed it up 3 times, before Stephen asked her if she had a problem. Valerie shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. I'll get it right this time." She took a moment and just concentrated on the scene. Dylan came into the room. "What's wrong with Rosie?" Dylan smiled. "Nothing to worry about. She's got a slight scrape on her leg, but no bones are broken. I applied some ointment. She should be good as new by this time next week." "Oh, good. I was worried." "I know. She's your best mare, but it's nothing serious at all. I'll come by this afternoon to check it out if you'd like." Joe nodded. "That would be great." She walked to him and put her hand on his arm, stroking it affectionately. "I appreciate how good you are about always easing my mind." Dylan's hands caught her hips and pulled her to him, looking down into her eyes. "I have to take care of my best girl." His head descended, and he gave her a kiss that turned her knees to mush. Her arms wrapped around him, and she clung to him. When he lifted his head, she said, "Thank you, Doctor." "You're very welcome." He kissed her nose quickly. "I'll see you this afternoon." She watched him stride away, closing the front door with a snap behind him. Cut. Stephen walked over to Valerie. "That was much better. I'm glad you've got your mind in the game again. Sorry about earlier. You've been married 3 days, you're bound to be a bit distracted." He rolled his shoulders. Time for the scene with Joe and Bob. She wrinkled her nose. I don't want him to kiss me. I know you don't. That's why the scene is going to look so good on film. She nodded, walking into the kitchen and grabbing another cup of coffee, downing it quickly. Joe was waiting in the kitchen when Bob walked into the house without knocking, as he usually did during working hours. Joe, I wanted to have a talk with you about the ranch today. I packed us a picnic lunch. Joe wrinkled her nose. All right. We can have lunch. I saddled your gelding for the ride. Bob indicated the two horses outside the window, and Joe followed him out. She swung her leg up over the saddle and rode with him to a spot along the side of the road. Bob spread out the quilt he'd tied behind his saddle and pulled the food from his saddlebags. Now what did you need to talk to me about? That couldn't wait. He spread the food out on the quilt while she sat on the ground, waiting for him. Bob had been Joe's father's foreman, and he had been obvious about his feelings for her since the day she'd taken over ownership of the ranch. She'd been just as obvious about her feelings for Dylan, after their initial season of getting to know each other. I've been patient with you and your little crush on the vet, but I think I've waited long enough, Bob said, biting into his sandwich. It was your father's wish that we marry, which I told you as soon as you took the ranch over. But it's not my desire we marry. Doesn't that matter to you at all? You haven't given me a chance, Joe. As soon as you saw Dylan Drake, you forgot all other men existed. You need to give me an honest try. It was your father's dying wish. She shook her head. Is that the only reason you brought me here? Are you saying you won't give me a fair chance? I've never hidden the fact that I have feelings for Dr. Drake. I'm not going to give anyone else a chance. Why would I? He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her to him. Valerie was just as disgusted as Joe was. She didn't want to be touched by anyone but Jesse. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was too strong. Bob crushed her to him, kissing her. She pounded on his chest to get away, and then she was pulled from him, and Dylan was there, throwing a punch at the foreman. Bob landed flat on his back on the ground, staring up at Dylan, who had fire in his eyes. You have no right to touch a lady who doesn't want to be touched. He still had anger in his eyes as he grabbed Joe's arm. I'll drive you back to the house. In the car, he shook his head. Why did you come out here with him? Why couldn't you stay at home where you were safe? She glared. I can take care of myself, Dylan. He's my employee, and I thought he wanted to give me an accounting of how the ranch was doing. By taking you on a romantic picnic lunch? How naive can you be? When the car stopped in front of the house, she got out and slammed the door. I don't need anyone managing my life. Not even you. She stormed into the house and slammed the door behind her. Stephen yelled out, "Cut." He was smiling as he walked over to her. That was perfect. Absolutely perfect. I could feel your anger with Dylan. She nodded briefly, realizing that she was a little angry with Jesse. It hadn't been hard to act angry. He seemed to be trying to take over her life, and that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted someone to be beside her, not someone who would completely control her life. She'd had enough controlling with Curtis. We'll do the scene where you and Dylan make up after lunch. Stephen strode away, and Jessie appeared at her side as if by magic. Are you hungry? She asked, wondering what they'd do for lunch. He nodded. Let's go back to your trailer for some sandwiches. She was surprised by how things were stilted between them. She'd thought once they finally made love, there would never be any tension. She'd been wrong. We need to talk. Yeah, we probably do, but I'm not sure I'm ready to talk. Why not? You were the one who dropped a bomb on me, not the other way around. Dropped a bomb? By telling you I love you? Jesse knew his anger was ridiculous. He'd been hiding his feelings from her for years, and he'd known she'd react the way she had. So why does it hurt so much? She sucked in a breath. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I knew how you'd react. Because you were dating someone else. Because you were so skittish I was afraid you'd never speak to me outside of work again. I was afraid it would ruin our chemistry on the set. He shook his head. But more than anything, because you weren't ready to hear it. She led the way into her trailer and stalked to the refrigerator. So why did you tell me this morning? You forced me into it. You and Jennifer. He sighed. I didn't want to scare you. I feel like I've been lied to for 4 years. I didn't lie to you. I never said I didn't love you. He frowned, picking up the bottle of water she'd placed in front of him and taking a swig. I honestly didn't feel like I had the right to tell you. You were dating someone else. Someone that you knew didn't treat me right. She couldn't help wondering how different her life would be if he'd admitted his love 4 years before. Would she have married him right away? It would certainly have saved her from 4 years of abuse. But you still chose to stay with him. Her face fell. I thought you understood what happened there. He sighed. I do understand, now. How could I then? I knew you two didn't have the kind of passion you and I had, but that didn't mean you didn't care for him. For all I knew, you thought you were madly in love with him. Where does this leave us? She asked, suddenly tired. She'd gone to bed the night before feeling like they could get through anything as long as they were together, and now this. He reached over and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. We're not in any different position than we were last night. I loved you then, and I still love you. The only difference is you know about it now, but my knowing it changes everything. At least in my mind. Not in mine. Jessie frowned. The only thing different for him is he'd wanted her to confess her love as soon as he'd confessed his, and she hadn't. I feel the same as I always have. I married you knowing I loved you, and you didn't love me back. It's the same now. Other than hurting a little more, of course. I can take it like a man, though. Valerie closed her eyes for a moment, feeling terrible. I care about you a great deal, Jessie. I know you do. I also know we have great chemistry. I believe you can fall in love with me if you let yourself. He shrugged. Eventually. So in the meantime, I get to feel guilty because our feelings are uneven? His eyes met hers, the hurt apparent in them. There's no reason for you to feel guilty. I knew what I was doing by marrying you. He took the hand he still held and pulled her over onto his lap. Val, let's just leave things like they've been. I've got the woman I love in my arms every night. You've got the feeling of safety you needed. We're okay, we're both getting what we need from the other. He recognized his words as a lie, but hoped she wouldn't. He needed so much more than her acquiescence in bed. He needed her love. She nodded, unsure of what else they could do. I guess. Did you call your agent to have her move your things yet? She smiled. Now I understand the manly sappiness. He grinned, tracing her lips with one finger. Of course, you do. Does that make it better or worse? Neither one. Things are just different. I'm still going to take care of you. She sighed. I appreciate the thought. I'm still going to learn to stand on my own 2 feet and take care of myself. They went back to work a short while later, hand in hand once again. Jessie's eyes were alert for trouble, but there was none. I felt like I was cheating on you when Bob kissed Joe. She rubbed her hand over her mouth as she said the words, trying to wipe the memory of the kiss she hadn't wanted from her lips. He smiled at that. Did you feel like you were cheating on Curtis when Joe kissed Dylan? She shook her head. No, but let's be really honest here. It was never Joe kissing Dylan. It was Valerie kissing Jessie. It was always you for me. He stopped walking and pulled her to him, kissing her passionately in the middle of the set for everyone to see. He pulled away as he heard the wolf whistles from the others. I'm so glad you said that. Makes me feel like it's me you care about after all. She touched her hand to his cheek. You know it is. Curtis came to the set on Tuesday, but security sent him away. The security guard went to Valerie afterward and pressed a note in her hand. He begged me to give you this. Valerie took it and tucked it into her pocket. She'd decide what she'd do with it later. There was no point in worrying about it right then. That evening, while Jessie was filming a quick scene without her, Valerie read the note. Dear Valerie, I know I couldn't have heard right, but people are saying you're married to Jessie. I know we had a little tiff, but we've had them before, and I'm sure we will again. I bought you a ring, and I was planning to propose when I came to the set last week. I'm sorry we fought, but seeing you kiss that man makes me go crazy with jealousy. It always has. Please forgive me. Curtis. She read through the note once more, before setting it on the table. At least he wasn't threatening her. She was sure it would come, but for now, he was being apologetic, just like he always was after he'd hit her. She sighed, deciding not to talk to Jessie about it yet. She wanted to take care of it herself for a change, not asking him to fix it for her. She had to learn to stand on her own 2 feet someday. Tucking the note into her wallet, she picked up her phone to call her mom. Hey. Hi, Valerie. How are things going for you? Good. We're filming some pretty intense scenes this week. She rubbed the back of her neck, exhausted from everything that had gone on for the past few days. Jessie really seems like a great guy. I can't wait to meet him. Valerie smiled at that. He is. Maybe we can fly there for a weekend on our next break. She was surprised 2 such important people in her life hadn't met yet. Has Ricky gotten over being mad at me yet? Her mother laughed. How did you know Ricky was mad? She's had a crush on Jessie for so long, I knew she'd be mad that I married him before she even had a chance to meet him. Yes, she was. A little. I think she's over it now. She's talking about how cute your kids will be. Valerie laughed at that. Yes, she's over it then. She took a drink of coffee from the mug in front of her. Have you heard anything else from Curtis? There was a pause before her mother responded. We took out the restraining order, and I blocked his number on my phone. He can't really get in touch with me at this point. Let me know if he tries, okay? I promise to phone if something happens. Valerie talked for another minute or 2 before hanging up. Amber had already done her filming for this episode, so she was off somewhere. Valerie debated for a minute before calling her. Hey you. Well, if it isn't Mrs. Jessie Savoy. I still can't believe you ran off and married him. Valerie laughed. It was his idea. I'm sure it was. The man's been in love with you for 4 years. As soon as you and Curtis fought, he made sure to make his move. Valerie frowned. You knew he loved me? Oh, honey, everyone knew he loved you, and I mean everyone. You think? I know. We all used to talk about it. The other actors on the show razzied him about it all the time. Why? Valerie truly didn't understand why the others would tease him about her. Amber laughed. Because he was so into you, and you didn't know he existed unless you were in a kissing scene together. I mean, he always had your friendship, but it was obvious there was nothing more on your side other than that intense passion. So what do people think now that we're married? That you finally came to your senses. Valerie wrinkled her nose. Wow. How did I not know all this was going on around me? Because you were too busy trying to hide from that jerk you were dating. Did everyone think he was a jerk? And why did you not tell me any of this stuff? Yes, everyone knew he was a jerk. I didn't tell you any of it, because I didn't think you were ready to hear it. I honestly don't know if you're ready to hear it now, but I don't feel like we can hide it anymore. Valerie sighed. I guess not. It's weird being married to a man who loved me for 4 years without me even having an inkling. She shook her head, thinking about how obvious it was for everyone but her. How blind could she be? He hasn't dated anyone else in 4 years. Did you think he was practicing celibacy to be a priest? Wait. He told me he hadn't dated in that long, but I didn't believe him. You mean it's true? Oh, honey. You've been his entire world for 4 years. He moons around during the off-season, because you're not there with him all the time. There's no one in his life but you. He has friends, Valerie protested. You're right. He does, and he spends time with his friends during the off-season. I don't want you to think he didn't do anything at all. The door opened then, and Jesse came into the trailer. He just got back. I'm going to pay attention to my man now. Your man. He'll like hearing that. Bye. Valerie stood up and walked over to Jesse, who looked tired. How'd the scene go? He shrugged. It was fine. I missed you. She put her hands flat on his chest and stood on tiptoe to kiss him. He raised an eyebrow, putting his hands on her hips to draw her closer. True or not, that's nice to hear. She frowned at him. Why wouldn't it be true? He sighed, taking her hand and leading her over to the love seat pressed against one wall. I guess I'm just worried you're going to start saying things like that out of pity. Because you want me to feel better about the fact that you don't love me back. She shook her head at him. I wouldn't have pegged you as someone who could be insecure about anything. He shrugged. Only about you. She knelt beside him, facing him. Don't be. I've never felt about anyone else the way I feel about you. He smiled at that. I guess that's a plus, right? She cupped his face in her hands, kissing him sweetly. I would think so. It means that I feel more for you than I ever have. But you've only ever been kissed by Curtis, and we all know what a chore that must have been. She rolled her eyes, stifling a laugh. Kissing Curtis had been a chore, but she wasn't about to reiterate that. Your kisses would make me forget any other kiss I'd ever had anyway. He laughed at that. You're really trying to make me feel better about all this, aren't you? She nodded. You know why? He shook his head. Because you're a nice person? Because I care. I care so much about you. He pulled her onto his lap, kissing her again. I think I like this side of you. Very kissable. She wound her arms around his neck. If you lock the door, we could probably manage to make love before we have to go film that night scene. He grinned. I like the way you think, wife. She smiled at that. I like being called wife by you. It sounds right. Chapter 6. A few hours later, Jesse and Valerie were getting dressed to go and film their night scene. What did Curtis say in the note he left you? She shrugged. How'd you know about the note? So much for her plan not to talk to him about it. I talked to the security guards and told them they needed to let me know if he tried to communicate with you in any way. Of course you did. I can take care of myself, you know. May I see the note? She nodded, hurrying over to her purse and pulling it out of her wallet. He was apologetic, just like he always is after he's been violent. It's the same cycle every time. I don't think he believes that we're really married. Jesse read the note she handed him, frowning down at it. Throwing a vase at your head is having a little tiff? And he thinks you'll just forgive him for it? And people are saying we're married? News stations that have interviewed us. He needs psychiatric help. The sad thing is, I think he does need it. And a lot of it. I don't want you going outside alone at all. If I have to film a scene without you, I'd like you to stay on the set where I can see you at all times. She sighed. So I'm going to have absolutely no alone time. She knew it wasn't common for an actress, but she was an introvert and always had been. She enjoyed her time with Jesse a great deal, but she needed time alone as well. He frowned. I know how much you love being alone, but I don't feel like it's safe right now. I understand. I really do. I just wish we could post a guard outside the trailer or something, so I could still have at least a little time alone to read. I forget how much you love to read. He took her hand as they left to go to the main house together. You still reading romance novels like they're going out of style? She nodded. They're my favorite. Not too much violence, and a whole lot of happily ever after. I just don't understand why someone would read a book when they weren't guaranteed a happily ever after at the end. There's enough bad stuff in the real world. I want to escape. He slipped his arm around her waist and pulled her to him. I see what you mean. I'm not going to let any bad stuff touch you, though. She sighed. I don't want to be smothered by bubble wrap and spend my time being protected from life. I want to get stronger, so I can handle things on my own. She rested her head against his shoulder. I think I've already gotten stronger by breaking up with Curtis. You have. Do you have any idea how proud I am that you broke up with him? She smiled. Will you still be proud when he comes in here with a machine gun and mows everyone down? He stopped walking. You don't really think he'll do that, do you? She shook her head. Not really, but he's so unpredictable. I never know what he'll do when he gets angry. I want to go into town tomorrow to put a restraining order out on him. Really? I thought you were going to protect me. She was surprised he was willing to take legal action. He was more the type who believed in dealing with bad situations himself. It was one of the things that drew her to him. I'm not sure anyone can. He shrugged. I'll keep you with me at all times, but I just don't feel like we can trust him not to go off the deep end. I guess not. Okay, we'll go tomorrow for the restraining order. Are there any scenes being filmed tomorrow that we're not in? Yeah, first thing in the morning is the scene with Bob and Joe's dad's lawyer. He's going to try to get the guy to talk to Joe about how much her dad wanted her to marry him. Oh, yeah. Have I mentioned lately how much I hate that storyline? I wish Bob would just go away, and we could have our happily ever after on the show. Jessie laughed. Sounds good to me. Then we could film lots of kissing scenes. We kiss all the time now. Why do you need kissing scenes? He shrugged. I guess they'll always be special to me after the years we went with that being our only physical contact. He paused. Why did you quit inviting me to hang out with you and Curtis? He'd been so hurt when she'd stopped wanting to see him away from work. She'd never changed how she treated him, though, so he'd felt Curtis had something to do with it. He got less violent when you stopped hanging around. He kept telling me that he wanted to hurt you for always mauling me on camera. Mauling you? Really? Jessie laughed. I guess he didn't realize what a willing participant you were. She grinned. If he had, I'd have been in big trouble. I never told him how very turned on I always was after those scenes. Oh really? How turned on were you? Jessie looked at her with a raised eyebrow. He liked hearing she'd had feelings for him too, even if they were only physical in nature. She blushed. Maybe it's time to change the subject. Jessie stopped just before they entered the house. No, tell me. She shrugged. I took lots of cold showers to calm down after those scenes. At first, I loved them, because they made me realize that I wasn't made of ice, no matter what Curtis said. And then they got to be too much, so I'd shower after each one. She tried to act as if it was perfectly normal she'd been so turned on by her co-star, but they both understood the deeper significance of what she was saying. It's almost like we were taking cold showers together, because that's where I headed immediately after each scene as well. He leaned down to kiss her softly. Valerie the virgin showering with her co-star for years while dating another man. You'd like to think of us showering together for all those years, wouldn't you? She shook her head, loving the line of his thinking, but refusing to admit it. He opened the door, and they entered the ranch house where most of the filming was done. Valerie had once asked why they didn't sleep in the house. The short answer was, they wanted it kept ready for filming at all times. Stephen was waiting for them both. Makeup. They wandered off to wardrobe to have their makeup done, and Valerie frowned. She was ready for their week off, so they wouldn't be interrupted constantly. After their final scene that night, Stephen called them both over. I've got you two on the night show on Friday to talk about lazy love, but most especially your marriage. The night show? Valerie squeaked. Really? You said you wanted to do all the shows. There was a cancellation, so they put you two in the slot. So are we wrapping early on Friday so we can fly to New York? She asked. Stephen nodded. Producers decided it was worth it to get the extra publicity for the show. Jessie wrapped his arm around her shoulders. We can catch a play while we're there if you want. I'd like that. Anything to take my mind off the night show. Jessie nodded to Stephen and started walking toward her trailer with her. How did you ever get to be an actress when you absolutely abhor being in front of people? She shrugged. I don't mind being in front of people if someone provides me with a script. After I messed up that one interview that got me pegged as Valerie the Virgin for the rest of my days, I decided I didn't ever want to be in front of people without a script again. I don't blame you for that, I guess. If you want, I'll make sure everyone knows you're no longer a virgin on the show. She pushed him playfully. Don't you dare. I would think the fact that we're married would clue most people in enough that you don't need to announce it. He chuckled. Well, I could give them a demonstration of how we kiss before we make love. Would that help? I think they've seen enough demonstrations of that on the show. They probably don't need any more. Jessie shook his head, as if saddened by her words. You never let me have any fun. Well, if you don't consider making love with me fun, I don't know what you'll call it. She stopped walking and put her hands on her hips, glaring at him. Oh, that? I call that essential for life. She laughed, loving his easy teasing. How did you ever live without it then? I don't know that I'd call what I was doing living. Merely existing. He gave a long-suffering sigh, and she slapped him playfully. You're crazy, you know. At least I'm fun crazy, and not creepy crazy. Well, that's true. You'd think I'd be able to find just one man in my life who wasn't insane, though, wouldn't you? He acted all offended by her words as he opened the door to the trailer to let her precede him inside. You'd think. Oh well. We'll have fun anyway. She stopped short as soon as she saw the table. Did you have flowers brought in? He hurried in and stopped when he saw the bouquet on the table. No, I didn't. You don't know where those came from? She shook her head, stiffening a little. Curtis does that sometimes when he knows I'm upset. He won't be here. He's long gone, so how did he get them in your trailer? She shrugged. It wasn't locked. She tried to hide the shudder that ran through her body. It wasn't over yet. It would never be over. Curtis wouldn't let her be happily married to another man without constantly making her feel as if he was watching over her shoulder. Jessie opened the door and spotted one of the security guards. Watch her for a minute, and he led her down the steps to the man. Have you seen Curtis around here? The guard shook his head. He was here this morning, but we ran him off. Looks like he left flowers on her table. You're going to need to start locking up, Mr. Savoy. The guard looked at Valerie. Do you want me to check it out while you keep an eye on her? No, I'll look. Jessie hoped to find the other man hiding somewhere in the trailer. He knew it was perverse, but he wanted nothing more than to take out his frustration on the other man with his fists. He checked every space where someone could have hidden, but Valerie was right. Curtis wasn't there. When he stepped back outside, he realized she was shaking. Let's drive into town and stay there tonight. There's a small hotel in Wiggyville. He couldn't let her stay in a place where she wouldn't feel safe, and there's no way she could feel safe in that trailer after Curtis was just there. She let out a shuddering breath before nodding. She wanted to protest that she wouldn't be run out of her own home, but she didn't have it in her. She couldn't stay there knowing he'd been in her trailer within the last couple of hours. All right. I'm going to pack a bag. Wait here. She stood with the guard, whose name she didn't even know, shifting from foot to foot. Thank you for waiting with me, he nodded. I'm sorry you're having to deal with him, Mrs. Savoy. Some men just don't know how to take the word no. Yeah. She wasn't about to explain anything to him, and she was more than a little relieved to see Jessie leaving the trailer and heading toward her. He had a suitcase in one hand and her purse in the other. Thought you'd want this, Jessie said, handing her the purse. Are you ready? Yup. She didn't know what else to say. All she wanted to do was get away from there. He led her to his car, and she climbed into the passenger seat. I'm so sorry, she said, mumbling the words as she brushed a tear from her cheek. What are you apologizing for? For getting you into this mess. You shouldn't have to be taking your wife off in the middle of the night because some freak doesn't know how to leave her alone. Jesse shook his head. I knew what I was getting into when I married you. You couldn't have known how bad it would be, she protested. He shrugged. I had an idea. I hope you know you're worth it to me. And so much more. She frowned. Wouldn't you rather I had no boyfriends in my past, and it was just you and me without having to look over our shoulders, though? Of course, I would. Mainly because that would save you a lot of fright and embarrassment. It's not your fault, though. I don't blame you for any of this. He pulled out onto the road and drove toward Wiggyville. Do you know if he's ever seen a psychiatrist? She shook her head. I don't. I could ask my mom. I think that's a good idea. If he's seen someone for this kind of behavior in the past, we might be able to build a case and get him into a psychiatric hospital. She pulled her phone from her pocket. Hey, Mom. I have a question for you. Do you know if Curtis has ever gotten help for his problems? Psychiatrist, counselor? Anything like that? She listened for a moment. Okay, thanks. Mom's going to find out. She wasn't sure, but she said it seemed as if he had. Okay, good. He reached over and took her hand, holding it tightly. You know you're going to be fine, right? I know you're going to try to take care of me. And I'm going to take care of myself. He pulled into a small hotel 20 minutes later, and she waited while he checked them in. When he got back to the car, he rubbed the back of his neck. Do you have any more of those promotional photos of us? Yeah, I always carry a few. She picked her purse up, glad that he'd thought to grab it before leaving. Desk clerk knew you? He nodded. And when I said I needed a room for two, he had read we'd gotten married. He said his wife would never believe him and asked for autographs. We'll sign them for him before we go up. She had no problem signing autographs. It was always easy to slip away once she had. Do you ever get tired of the fans always hounding us for autographs? He asked. She shrugged. I'm just thankful the fans are paying the bills. I think of them as my bosses. He laughed. I guess I never thought of it that way. Without them, we'd just be a couple of people play acting in our spare time. She meant her words too. She was in the entertainment industry, and she knew she was good at what she did, but if there was no one to entertain, she'd be waiting tables. Good point. He grabbed the suitcase he'd packed from the back seat. After you. They stopped at the front desk and she took out the picture she had, signing it quickly to the front desk clerk's wife and then having Jesse do the same. I hope she likes it. The man, in his late 40s, stood with a goofy grin on his face. She's going to love it, and I will be the best man alive for a few hours. Valerie laughed. Enjoy your time as the king of the world then. Oh, trust me I will. I'm in the doghouse right now, so this is just what I need to get out again. Thank you so much. Jesse smiled, nodding to the man, and heading for the elevator. You handle one-on-one fan encounters a lot better than I do. Which is a good thing, because you handle the interviews so much better. I'm really worried about Friday night. She just knew she was going to slip up and say something stupid again. Just so her sex life didn't get discussed, she'd be good. Of course, her sex life was always discussed at interviews. Jesse shrugged. Don't be. I'll do most of the talking. What if they bring up that awful name? She asked as he opened the door to their room with the keycard. I'll tell them that you said you'd be a virgin till you married, and you were. We can leave it at that. She shook her head. I hate the fact that they call me that. I bet they don't call you that anymore. We're married now, and people have seen the heat between us. There's no way anyone thinks you're still a virgin. I wonder what they'd say if they knew we'd waited a couple of nights. Who cares? He asked. What we did after we married was our own business. No one has any right to know, and even if they did, it wouldn't matter. He locked the door behind him and set the suitcase down. It wouldn't matter to you, because the paparazzi hasn't been obsessed with your sex life for the past 4 years. He grinned. No, they haven't, because I haven't had one. About that, Amber told me that you really haven't been with a woman since you met me. Is that true? He shrugged. Does it matter? It does to me. If he'd truly been celibate since meeting her, that meant that his feelings for her were stronger than she'd realized. His sex drive was strong, and going without for her was almost unbelievable. I haven't. I had a girlfriend the day I met you, but we weren't serious. We'd been dating for a couple of months. I broke up with her the next day. I knew I only had eyes for you. I feel like I've been running around with blinders on for the past 4 years. Valerie shook her head. Why was I the only one who didn't know how you felt? I honestly don't think you wanted to know. Even the security guards knew. I was the butt of every joke. It didn't bother you? She asked. He shrugged. I'm a big boy, I could take it. I couldn't help my feelings for you, and I didn't want to. Loving you, whether or not you ever love me back, has made me a better man. I've had someone besides myself to focus my energies and attentions on. She took his hand and led him to the huge king-sized bed in the middle of the room, sitting down on the foot of the bed. I think you're the best man I've ever known. You do you? And you're not just saying that because you know I'm in love with you, and you can't honestly say the words back. Her heart jumped into her throat. She knew she was close to being able to say the words back, but she wouldn't. Not yet. Not until she was completely certain that she meant them. And not until she knew Curtis was out of her life forever. I thought that before we ever married. I had a lot of respect for you as an actor and as a person. You were my friend, whether Curtis liked it or not. He put his arm around her, pulling her toward him. You know, I'm happier than I've ever been. I don't like the whole Curtis thing looming over us, but I'm married to the woman I've loved for years. I get to take you to bed every night and make love to you, and I get to work with you all day, every day. You are the center of my life. She frowned. I still feel inadequate. I don't feel like I deserve that kind of love. Whether you deserve it or not, you have it, and it'll never go anywhere. If I spend the rest of my life waiting for the words, then I do. You're the one that I love. I could break into song, but no one wants to hear that. She laughed. Thank you. Thank you for choosing me as the object of your love and affection. He squeezed her hand. I'm glad to have you beside me. Chapter 7. Jessie took Valerie to the police station the following morning so they could take out the restraining order. She hated having to explain her history to the police officer, who obviously knew her from the show. Officer Hamilton was kind but pointed with his questions. Did you ask him to leave you alone? I broke off our relationship, and I work on a closed set. He's continuing to send me notes, and he entered my trailer last night to leave me flowers. Valerie clung to Jessie's hand while she answered the questions. Did you feel threatened by the flowers? She nodded. I felt threatened by the fact that he entered my living space without me there. I will start locking my trailer. It had never seemed important to lock it, because the set was supposed to be closed. Not that it mattered with Curtis. Officer Hamilton looked at Jessie. Do you feel as if your wife is in any kind of danger? Jessie glanced at Valerie, not wanting to make her uncomfortable, but knowing everything needed to be said. Yes, I do. I know he's abused her for the past 4 years. The officer's face remained passive. Why didn't you end the relationship before now, Mrs. Savoy? Valerie took a deep breath, wishing she could explain her behavior in ways that made sense to people who had never been in the same situation. I was afraid to. He threatened me often, and I was afraid he would hurt my family or myself. She glanced at Jessie. I don't know that I could have done it this time if Jessie hadn't heard the commotion and come to help me. What commotion would that be? Valerie's eyes met the officer's. He threw a vase at me and hit the wall beside my head. The sound of it breaking brought Jessie running. The officer made a note. And this happened when? Friday afternoon, Jessie answered for her. And you were married when? Valerie's face flushed. Late Friday night. Were you planning to marry before this incident? Jessie was sick of the questions. I'd been in love with Valerie for 4 years now. As soon as she was single, I begged her to marry me. I did it partially to protect her from her former boyfriend. There were no plans to marry before she broke it off with Curtis, but I would have welcomed a marriage at any point for the past 4 years. So the two of you weren't having an affair while she was in a relationship with him? Valerie felt sick to her stomach at the question. No, sir, we weren't. We had never even kissed unless it was called for in the script before Friday afternoon. Jessie frowned at the officer. She's telling the truth, though I don't know why it matters. Even if we had been having an affair, which we weren't, he had no right to hit her. Ever. No, of course, he didn't. The man continued to make notes, while Valerie stared at her hands. Finally, he stood up. Thank you for your answers. Jessie shook hands with him. He'll be arrested if he gets too close to her? Yes, of course. Officer Hamilton looked uncomfortable for a moment. I admire your work. Your show is one of my favorites on television. I love that it's filmed so close to Wiggyville. Thank you, Valerie said with a smile. She couldn't not react well to a fan, even one who had made her feel cheap. Jessie put his arm around her shoulders and guided her out to the car. I hate that you had to go through that. She shrugged. It's part of this lovely mess I've made of my life. He turned to her in the car, his hand gripping hers tightly, trying to pass his strength to her. You didn't make a mess of your life. And you're doing a great job of cleaning up the mess he made. She leaned into him, her face going to his shoulder. I'm glad I have you to lean on when I'm not feeling so strong. He tilted her face up to his, kissing her sweetly. You know, I'm happy to be here for you. She nodded. You're the type who would have been there for anyone. I am. But it's so much easier with you. She sighed. We have to get back to the set before Stephen comes looking for us. She moved over to buckle her seatbelt while he started the car. Stephen hadn't sent out a search party, but he was getting close. I heard what happened. I was worried you two weren't coming back in time. Valerie smiled. We're professionals. Just took a little longer at the police station than we thought. Stephen put a hand on Valerie's arm and smiled, before turning to Jessie. I've hired an extra 6 security guards. 2 more per shift. Good. I don't want Curtis getting on this set at all. A guard will be outside Valerie's trailer at all times. Valerie sighed. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm looking forward to the night show. At least we won't be stuck here waiting for him to do something. Their last scene of the day was a hot and heavy kissing scene at the ranch house where Joe lived. When Dylan took Joe into his arms, on a blanket spread on the floor in front of the fireplace, Valerie completely forgot she was acting. Always before, some part of her mind had retained the knowledge that people were watching them, but this time was different. Jesse's arms moved around her, and his mouth descended on hers. Her arms moved around his torso, her hands going under his shirt without thinking about it. Always before, she'd had to be told how deep to get into character, and she'd been told where to place her hands. No direction was needed this time. Her hands explored his back as she clutched him to her. She felt him lower her onto her back on the blanket, and one leg wrapped around his. When the phone rang on cue, she jerked away from Jesse, startled. The look of passion was still on her face as she answered it. Hello? She paused a moment to listen. Yes, he's here. I'll put him on. She held the phone out to Dylan, doing her best to stay in character. He kissed her again as he took the phone from her, an unscripted kiss. This is Dr. Drake. He paused, his hand stroking up and down her arm as he listened. Yes, I'll be right there. He dropped the house phone back into the cradle and pulled her to him once more. I'm sorry for the interruption, he whispered against her lips. Lunch tomorrow? She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. I'll cook. He nodded, hurrying toward the door. When Stephen yelled, "Cut," Valerie didn't wait. She hurried out the door after Jesse, taking his hand and dragging him off toward the trailer they were sharing. Jessie asked no questions, understanding her need. As soon as they were inside, he closed and locked the door, holding her against it as he kissed her. "I need you." Valerie wrapped her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist, never taking her mouth from his. He carried her to the bedroom and lowered her onto the bed, coming down atop her, stripping off his shirt along the way. "Everyone knows exactly what we're doing," she said, breathlessly. "I can't care about that right now. Don't ask me to." She shook her head. "I won't." She caught him around the neck, pulling his lips back to hers. Nothing mattered but getting them both naked. Nothing. An hour later, Jessie lifted his head from the pillow. "I'm going to ask for more kissing scenes to be written into the script." Valerie laughed. This was so much better than a cold shower. He shook his head at her. What would the press say about Valerie the Virgin if they could see her now? She blushed. "I don't know, and I don't want to. I hope no one thinks to interview the cast and crew about how things have been different between us since we married." He chuckled, picturing it. Well, they used to run off after their kissing scenes, and they'd each take a cold shower. They'd show up later with their skin all blue from the ice water they dumped over their heads. Now, they head back to her trailer, and you wouldn't believe the sounds we hear. Valerie giggled. "Yeah, I don't want to see that right up." He grinned at her. "I hope you know you've made me the happiest man alive, because I dragged you back to the trailer after our kissing scene? Because you've agreed to share your life with me. I still can't believe how lucky I am to have you beside me." She shook her head. "I'm the lucky one, Jess. Your love makes me so much more than I've ever been." He leaned down and kissed her softly. "We complete each other. I think I knew it before we even kissed, when I saw you read the lines for Joe. It took me longer. I didn't know it until you'd kissed me. Just keep on believing it." The crew wrapped early on Friday afternoon, so Jessie and Valerie could catch their flight to New York. She had tucked her hair under a ball cap, hoping to avoid recognition, and he'd put on a pair of glasses. True fans would still spot them, but maybe they would be able to avoid having to sign autographs on the plane. "The show is filmed at 10, so we'll have just enough time to land and get to the studio. The network will have a car waiting to drive us there." Jessie leaned over the partition between the seats as he talked to her. She nodded. "I'm still really nervous about this one. Isn't this the show where you said you were going to stay a virgin till you married?" "Don't remind me." He grinned. "I watched that night, and I was so happy to hear you say that. It meant you weren't sleeping with Curtis. I think I'd have had to kill him if you had been." She shook her head. "You would not." "Probably not. But I'd have considered it." She pulled her script out of her purse. "I'm going to work on learning my lines for next week. I want to be able to enjoy our time in New York." "Oh, I guarantee we'll enjoy our time in New York." He ran his hand down her arm, leaving her no doubt as to his thoughts. "I do want to see a show. There's television in the hotel room. We'll watch a show after." She laughed. "Jessie, you really are naughty at times." "Only with you." Valerie paced back and forth nervously backstage while she waited for their names to be called. Jessie finally caught her by the hand and held her still. "You're making me dizzy. Will you promise to grab me and kiss me if I start to say something stupid?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I have permission to stop you from talking by kissing you." He raised an eyebrow, letting her know that there was no question of his taking advantage. He would. "Only if I say something stupid." "Well, if you start talking, I won't know what you're going to say, so I'll just have to keep kissing you." She sighed, shaking her head. "Forget I said anything." One of the backstage attendants came to them. "1 minute before you're on." Valerie started breathing quickly, getting more nervous by the second. Jessie pulled her to him and kissed her, not to shut her up, but to calm her down. Of course, it just served to stir them both up in a different way. "Next, we have our special guests, Valerie Dobson and Jessie Savoy, the stars of Lazy Love." Jessie pulled her out onto the main stage, their hands gripping each other's tightly. They took the 2 seats next to the desk where the host sat, and each of them pinned on a microphone. "So, I hear you 2 crazy kids ran off and got married." Jesse grinned, bringing Valerie's hand to his lips and kissing it softly before answering, much to the appreciation of the audience who gave a joint "Ah." "We did. We've been married for a week today." He wrapped his arm around Valerie's shoulders, feeling her lean against him. "She's made me the happiest man on earth." The host, Matt Winters, smiled at that. "There have been rumors for years that you were in love with Valerie, even though she was dating another man. What do you have to say to that?" Jesse kept his face passive. "I married her the day she broke off her relationship with that other man." "What do you think?" The audience laughed, and as Valerie looked out at them, she saw many of the women looking at the 2 of them with sappy expressions. "Valerie, you famously came on this show 4 years ago and said you'd be a virgin until the day you married. Did you make it?" She smiled, having anticipated the question. "I did." Though some of those scenes with Jesse made it hard. "In more ways than one," Jesse said, a grin transforming his face as he looked at Valerie. "Jesse," she said with a blush. "I'm sorry, Matt. He hasn't quite learned to behave yet when he doesn't have someone give him the words to say. I think I'm going to have to start giving him a script before every public appearance." She had thought the same about herself just a few minutes before, so it was nice to be able to tease Jesse about that. Matt grinned, looking back and forth between them. "You look very happy, Valerie. I guess married life agrees with you." "Being married to Jesse agrees with me. I couldn't ask for a more attentive, sweet husband. And he's even sappy in a very manly way." Jesse glared at her. "You promised you wouldn't tell anyone." "I did say it was manly sap." She leaned over and kissed his cheek. The audience roared with laughter. Matt waited a moment for them to quiet down. "Audiences have been tuning in to Lazy Love for 4 years now, just to see you 2 kiss on screen. How much of that chemistry that's between you 2 is just show?" Valerie shook her head. "Not 1 iota. It's all been as real as you see on the television from the first time we kissed." "Well, then, I think that calls for a live kiss for my audience." Matt turned to the big crowd. "What do you all think? Kiss. Kiss. Kiss," the audience chanted. Valerie looked at Jesse, her eyes wide. He shrugged back at her, taking her hand and pulling her to her feet. Lowering his head, he captured her lips with his, kissing her with all the passion that was raging through him after hours of them being in public together. Valerie wrapped her arms around him and kissed him back, clinging to his shoulders. When Jesse raised his head, his eyes were darker as they always were after a kiss. No acting necessary. There were catcalls from the audience. Jesse sat back down, but this time, he tugged her onto his lap instead of letting her take her own chair. "We're newlyweds. You'll all indulge us, right?" Matt laughed. "Well, you 2 seem genuinely happy. We wish you all the best." "Thank you," Valerie said softly. "I do need to point out there was an error when you introduced us, though." "An error? What kind of error?" Matt was obviously perplexed. "My name is Valerie Savoy now. Dobson was my maiden name." Matt chuckled at that. "So you're going to be old-fashioned and take his name, are you?" "I think I made it clear the last time I was on the show that I'm an old-fashioned kind of girl." "You did at that." Matt shook his head. "So, are you hoping for kids right off? Or are you going to wait?" Valerie looked at Jesse with wide eyes. "You know we've never even discussed it. We were too busy enjoying being married." Jesse shrugged. "I think we'd both like to have children, so if they happen right off, it won't disappoint us. The writers may have some trouble writing them into the show, but hopefully the next time Dylan proposes to Jo, she'll say yes." "How many times has your character proposed to hers now?" Matt asked. 3, Jesse said. "I'm glad Valerie didn't make me ask her over and over again. It's hard enough to do it for a show. In real life, I think I'd go insane." "Do you know if they plan to marry them off this season? Or next?" Valerie grinned while shaking her head. You know we can't tell you that, even if we know. The truth was, she had no idea if they were planning to marry them off, but she had a feeling they'd do it soon. They wouldn't want an unplanned pregnancy for Joe. Well, we've got a clip here to show. Can you set it up for us? Valerie and Jessie exchanged looks. I have no idea what they sent you, Valerie said, with her eyes wide. I guess we'll all be surprised. Matt pointed to the big screen in the middle of the stage. Let's see. Valerie slipped off Jessie's lap and back into her own chair, so she could see better. She rarely watched the show, because she got too worked up. Her eyes on the screen, she grinned when she saw the scene. It was the one they'd filmed right before she'd noticed Curtis was on the set a week before. As she watched, Jessie kissed her and his hands were under her shirt. She had a leg wrapped around his waist, and she was sitting on the kitchen counter. When he tried to talk her into going to the bedroom, she pulled back, her face red and flushed. As the scene faded away, she felt herself blushing. The whole world saw incredibly intimate scenes between her and her husband on a weekly basis. Matt picked up the papers with his questions on them and fanned his face with them. Hooey. You two outdid yourselves on that one. He looked at Jessie. You get paid to do that? Jessie grinned. We agreed to get married not an hour later. I can see why. Matt shook her head. That's why people tune in for your show. You two have some incredible chemistry. I hope they let your characters marry soon. I'm just glad we didn't have to wait for the writers to decide it was time. Jessie said with a wink at Valerie. Matt got to his feet and shook hands with first Jessie and then Valerie. I want to thank Jessie and Valerie Savoy for joining us tonight. Valerie lifted a hand in a wave to the audience as they exited the stage. As soon as they were behind the curtain, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. We did it. You were awesome. You didn't seem at all bothered by the questions he asked. She rested her head against his shoulder. Thank you for lending me your courage. He wrapped his arm around her, and they walked out to the car the network had waiting to take them to their hotel. Do we really have to play tourist this weekend? He asked as they settled into the back seat. One play is all I ask. He nodded. Sure. He didn't mind taking her to a play on Broadway, but he felt much safer when they stayed in. He'd take care of her, though. Chapter 8. The next week's filming went by without incident, and Friday evening Jessie and Valerie flew to LA for their week off. I'm really nervous about going back to LA. Why? Jessie asked. All of your stuff is at my house now, and Curtis doesn't know where that is. He didn't want her to worry about her ex. That was his job. It's not that hard to find you. He shrugged. I live in a house with a wall surrounding it, and there will be security guards posted at the gate by the time I get home. My agent arranged it. He's not going to risk anything happening to either of us. You don't think? She didn't trust Curtis. She'd known him to do some crazy things. No, I don't. I think he's going to try to get at you on the set. Does that mean I don't need a babysitter in LA? She asked. She loved the time they got together, but she hated to feel like she needed to be watched at all times. Jessie sighed, moving her hand to his lips and kissing it softly. It's only for a little while. Why? She looked at him in confusion. Do you think he's going to give up soon? Or do you think he's going to make a move? Jessie shrugged. Honestly, I don't think he'll ever give up. I think you'll be hiding from him for the rest of your life if he isn't caught. Valerie sighed. I hate that. I'll be an old grandmother someday, and still watching over my shoulder for him. Nope. He's up to something. We just have to wait him out. He turned to her more fully. But about children, are you wanting kids right away? We've never talked about it. She shrugged. I haven't thought about it a lot, but it wouldn't upset me to have them. I love kids. Well, it's something we need to talk about, because I'm not using any protection, and I'm assuming you aren't either. She shook her head. I guess I never thought of that. We've both had a lot on our minds lately. Yeah, ending a relationship of 8 years, getting married, working every day, and flying all over the country every weekend can do that to you. She rubbed the back of her neck with her free hand. Do you realize we have been on both coasts and in the middle of the country all in the space of a week? You were the one who wanted to be a famous actress. She shook her head. Actually, I'm not sure that I ever wanted to be famous. Small parts here and there were all I was really looking for. I wanted to make a living with acting, but I figured I'd have the kind of role Amber does. Ah. Yeah, the kid sister to the star. Didn't work out that way for you, did it? He rubbed his thumb over her lips, wishing they were alone. She recognized the look in his eyes and patted his shoulder as if to tell him to calm down. No, but I think it would have if you hadn't been there auditioning the same day I was. He shrugged. I'm not so sure. You're a wonderful actress. Valerie smiled at that. I'm decent. But the magic we create on screen together is what everyone wants. If either of us left the show, it wouldn't last another season. We have 3 morning talk shows this week, Jessie told her casually. We'll film them Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday mornings. She groaned. Mornings? Can't we do the late night shows? He grinned, loving that he'd found her ultimate weakness, mornings. I'll make the coffee while you shower. You really do love me, she said softly, grabbing the front of his shirt and pulling him down for a kiss. He laughed. If all I have to do to prove my love is make you coffee, you can expect it every day for the rest of your life. Well, I need chocolate on occasion as well. Chocolate and coffee make a woman feel very loved. What about flowers and diamonds? He kept his face serious, but she saw the twinkle of amusement in his eyes. Well, flowers and diamonds are all well and good, but coffee and chocolate? I'll fall into your arms any day for coffee and chocolate. He laughed, touching the tip of her nose with his finger. I'll keep that in mind. They hopped into a cab together after rushing through the airport. They both left enough clothes in each place that they didn't have to take suitcases back and forth, so there was no checked luggage. After Jessie gave his address, they leaned back against the seat, her head on his shoulder. I can't believe how sleepy I am. It's been a long couple of weeks. I'm excited to see your house. I never had the chance. You were invited to a party when I first moved in. She shrugged. I think you know what happened there. She'd asked Curtis to take her, and he'd become violent. Thankfully he hadn't bruised her anywhere that couldn't be covered by her clothes. His hand rubbed her thigh. Of course, I know. You'll see it tonight. Or tomorrow if you're too tired. She rubbed her cheek against his shoulder, liking that she felt comfortable enough to lean on him. His house was big, but not huge. It was surrounded by a white wall for privacy, and there was a gate that looked to be new with men stationed at it. The driver stopped at the gate. Jessie opened the door and stood up. Thank you for stopping us. The guard nodded. Mr. Savoy, it's good to meet you. You too. Your duty has been explained to you? Yes, sir. No one gets in or out without your consent. Mrs. Savoy is our primary focus. Exactly. Jessie got back into the cab and they drove up the drive to the front of the house. He paid the driver and took her carry-on from her. Come on. When he'd bought the house 2 years before, he'd had her comfort in mind. He hadn't done a lot of decorating, because he'd known he wanted her to be able to do it. He'd lived for the dream of marrying her one day. As he unlocked the door and led her inside, he watched her face carefully. He desperately wanted her to be happy with his choice. When Valerie stepped inside the house, she felt as though she was coming home. I love it, she said softly. He smiled at that. I hoped you would. He dropped their bags and took her hand, giving her a quick tour of the downstairs. The last room he took her into was the kitchen, which was huge and made with a cook in mind. Oh, I can't wait to cook here. He raised an eyebrow at that. You cook? More than sandwiches? She made a face. There's not much you can cook in one of those trailers with only a fridge, sink, and microwave. You wait. I'll make you a meal you'll never forget. He grinned, opening a door to the backyard. There was a pool with a built-in hot tub. I know how much you love water. She smiled at him. They'd never talked about swimming, but they'd filmed a couple of pool scenes together. He seemed to have catalogued her reaction to everything they'd done in the 4 years since they'd met. How could she have missed his love for all that time? Now that she knew, it was obvious in the way he touched her, the way he looked at her, but most importantly, in the little things he remembered about her. I love it. It's almost like you bought this place with me in mind. His eyes remained steady on hers, as he waited for her to come to the obvious conclusion. When she didn't seem to comprehend immediately, he said so softly she could barely hear it, I did. Tears filled her eyes. I'd have broken up with him if I'd known. I would have come to you. His hand cupped her cheek, a smile transforming his face. Really? She nodded. Really. When he kissed her, there was no passion involved. Only sweet tenderness. Her heart was full as she held his shoulders, clinging to him. You're tired, he whispered, kissing her forehead. Let's go to bed. There's plenty of time to explore tomorrow. She nodded. Thank you for always caring so much about what I need. I love you. She couldn't say it yet, but she knew she did. Why, she'd probably loved him for as long as he'd loved her. She just hadn't been able to show it. She let him lead her upstairs, to his room. The only picture there was a shot taken of the two of them, laughing into each other's eyes after a scene had been filmed. She remembered the day, but had never seen the photo. Where did you get this? She asked, walking to the dresser and picking it up. He smiled. Amber took it. And she just gave it to you? Oh, no. We negotiated for a long time on her price for that. I had to have it, though. She charged you for it? Valerie couldn't keep the giggle out of her voice. Charged me in labor. I had to spend hours going over her lines with her for that play she was in a couple of years ago between seasons. Remember? She nodded. I do remember. I knew you'd spent a lot of time with her. For a little while I thought you two were hooking up, but she said that you were true. Which made no sense at the time, but sure does now. He took the picture from her hands and put it back on the dresser. Were you jealous? Of course not. He laughed at her quick denial. You could let me have my dreams, you know. Her hand went to his cheek, and she pulled his face down for a kiss. You know, I've felt more for you than any other man I've ever known. Stop being so greedy. I can't. I need to know I have all of you. He turned and walked into the bathroom, closing the door and leaning back against it. It was harder to be married to her without her love than he'd realized. Someday. They had a leisurely weekend. Valerie's agent, Jessica, had done as promised and moved all of her things, and then she'd come over and unpacked for her, making certain things would be ready when she got there. On Sunday afternoon, Valerie looked over at Jessie, who was sitting on the couch watching her as she explored the kitchen. We need food. I want to cook you a nice dinner tonight. He shook his head. You don't have to cook. I know you're as tired as I am after 3 weeks of intense shooting. I want to cook. I enjoy it. It relaxes me. So you want me to take you to the grocery store? He made a face. That doesn't sound very romantic. Real life isn't just about romance. She reached for his hand. I don't mind going alone, but I don't think you want that. Jessie stood up, enfolding her tiny hand in his. He was always surprised at just how small she was. I guess we're going to the grocery store. I guess we are. At all 3 interviews that week, they showed the same clip from the episode they'd been filming when Valerie and Jessie had decided to marry. Every time she watched the clip, she was astounded when she thought about how many times they'd done scenes like that together without her realizing how he felt. Or how she herself felt. For 4 years, every time he'd walked into a room she was in, her heart had skipped a beat, and she'd never once considered she was in love with him. Every kiss they'd shared had been chronicled in her memory and replayed over and over. She'd gone to sleep at night, remembering the feel of his lips on hers. She'd wanted to spend every waking moment with him. If that wasn't love, she didn't know what was. After they arrived back in Texas to start their next episode, Valerie was happy to see they'd kept up their vigilance surrounding the set. The extra guards were there, making her feel safer. On Sunday night before filming began, she called her mother, making sure everything was still all right at home. Yes, of course everything is fine, her mother insisted. Curtis has been staying next door with his parents, but he hasn't made any attempts to even come over here. Good. I'm still worried about you guys. Don't let Ricky talk to him. You know how she is. She'll feel sorry for him and think she needs to take care of him. Ricky is smarter than that. I hope so. Her younger sister had a huge heart, and she was always going out of her way to help the injured. Valerie was afraid Ricky would see Curtis as injured and want to help him, whether he needed it or not. Just make sure she knows that I'm the injured party and not Curtis. I'll do my best. Valerie hung up the phone and looked over at Jesse where he was supposed to be studying his script, but was watching her instead. She got up and walked over to where he sat on the couch, climbing onto his lap and pushing his script away. I'm a lot more interesting than that script. You'll get no arguments from me. She grinned, kissing him. I'm worried my sister is going to do something stupid. Why? Curtis is staying with his parents, so he's right next door to Mom and Ricky. She has this thing for injured people and animals. I'm afraid she's going to think I was mean to Curtis, breaking up with him and marrying you so quickly. How old is she again? 20, but she's a young 20, like I was. When you grow up in such a small town, you don't have a lot of opportunities to grow up quickly. She's in college, but she commutes. She doesn't even live on campus. He frowned for a moment. We can't protect her. I tried to talk your mom into letting us hire a couple of bodyguards for the two of them, but she wouldn't hear of it. You did? When did you talk to my mom? He realized then he'd put his foot in it. I talk to her sometimes while you're in the shower. I want to make sure they're safe. Are you taking care of me again? I can't seem to help myself. He pulled her to him, kissing her. Are you mad? She shook her head. No, I'm not mad. But I do think people need to give me credit for being strong enough to take care of myself at times. I know you can take care of yourself sometimes. But sometimes, I like to be the one making sure you're safe. It makes me feel all manly and sappy and stuff. She laughed softly. And manly sap is so important. It is to me. Chapter 9. On Friday afternoon, Jesse received a call shortly after they finished filming for the day that had him upset. Valerie asked him about it. Who was on the phone? He debated for a moment about whether he'd tell her, but she had a right to know what was happening. Your sister didn't come home from work last night. He watched her face carefully for her reaction. She stopped in her tracks, halfway back to the trailer. What? Has Mom heard from her? Why did she call you and not me? He slipped his arm around her shoulders and guided her back toward the trailer. No, she hasn't heard from her yet. She called me because we've been talking about all of this regularly. I told her to contact me, because I knew you'd hear it better in person than you would over the phone. She shook her head, trying to think about where her sister could be. Does she have any friends she could be staying with? What exactly did Mom say? He waited until they were in the trailer with the door closed to answer. All of her friends have been checked with, and no one knows where she is. She was last seen leaving the grocery store where she works at 9 last night, and her car is still parked out front. Curtis disappeared too, didn't he? Yeah, he did. We're going to find her though. I promise. We just have to stay calm. You can be calm. I'm going to panic. This is my sister we're talking about. How dare he expect her to be calm? It wasn't his sister. Jesse reached out to rub his hands up and down her arms. I know that. I do. Your mom called the police first thing this morning when she knew Ricky was missing. What about the FBI? The CIA? The National Guard? This is my sister. I'm sure the police know the right people to call. He led her to the couch and pulled her down beside him. Here's the deal. I really don't think he's going to hurt her. I think he needs her to be healthy enough to call you. You're what he wants. Valerie closed her eyes, nodding. I know I am. But you're not going to use yourself as ransom money. Jessie's eyes were steady and clear on hers. I don't care what he says. You aren't going. Valerie just nodded, knowing if she got the opportunity, she'd do it in a heartbeat. Her sister shouldn't suffer because Valerie had made bad choices. It wasn't right. Will you teach me to shoot? He looked at her with surprise. I thought you didn't want to learn. I didn't. Now I do. He nodded slowly. I bought a gun. It's in my trailer. We can work on shooting tomorrow. They'd drive off the set to land the production company owned. No one would care if he spent a few hours on Saturday teaching her to shoot. Thank you. Jessie took Valerie to the spot he'd decided on the following afternoon. Valerie was reminded of how much she hated firearms as soon as she touched the handgun, but she'd do whatever it took. Never again would she feel this defenseless. They practiced for hours until she could consistently hold the gun steady as she fired, the whole time Jessie gave her pointers. If you ever have to shoot a person, aim for the chest, not the head. The head is a smaller target. If you hit the chest, you've stopped him. Valerie hoped it would never come to that. Shooting at old soda cans was one thing. Shooting at a human being was something else entirely. She didn't think she'd even be able to shoot an animal. How could she hurt anyone or anything? Finally, Jessie took the gun from her. I think that's enough for today. Do you think I could defend myself? He nodded. I know you could. You're not going to have to, but you could. She didn't argue with him. She didn't have to. He could see in her eyes that she wanted to protest that she could take care of herself. Let's drive into Wiggyville for dinner, he suggested, taking her hand and pulling her toward his car. You know, Wiggyville is a very strange name for a town. People around here act like it's the most normal thing in the world. He shrugged. There's a little steakhouse there. Very romantic. She stopped walking and turned on him, one eyebrow raised. Oh? And you know this how? People talk. I've been there with some of the crew. Where was I? She knew she was being difficult. She'd always stayed to herself during shooting, never trusting that Curtis wouldn't pop out of nowhere. If she was with Jessie when he showed up, she knew she'd suffer for it. Why? Jealous? Of course not. But she was. She knew she was. He'd said he'd loved her and been faithful for 4 years. He'd better not have been out with anyone else. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders as soon as they were in the car. Well, it was more of a guy night. The directors and some of the crew, and Bob, of course. Of course. Bob was the only actor on the show who had the same real name as his character. We can't forget Bob. No, ma'am, we can't forget Bob. He keeps turning up like a bad penny. She laughed. Oh, Jessie. I feel so guilty being with you and laughing when Ricky is out there with Curtis somewhere. You really don't think he'll hurt her? He shook his head. His ultimate goal is to get you back. He knows if he hurts someone you love, that will never happen. It's never going to happen anyway. I'm married to you. She rested her hand on his chest. I don't know why he thinks things can go back to the way they were. I don't either. Just promise me you won't do something stupid. She frowned at him. Something stupid? Did you really just say that? You know what I mean. I don't want you to try to be all heroic and go looking for your sister or something. There's no point, because I have no idea where she'd be. And if you did, you wouldn't attempt anything stupid. Right? There's that word again. I don't think I like it. She carefully skirted his question, knowing that if there was something she could do to help her sister, she would do it in a heartbeat. I'd like to start keeping the gun in our trailer. I want to know we have access to it if we need it. He didn't like that, but nodded. I think that might be necessary at this point. You're not walking 10 feet without me. I'm not a possession. She tilted her head back to look up at him. I'm stronger than anyone gives me credit for. No, you're not a possession. You're the woman I love, and I don't know what I'd do if you were hurt. I'm fine. Stop worrying. He sighed, pulling the car out onto the highway toward Wiggyville. Let's go to that steakhouse. She grabbed her purse and looked inside, digging for something. What are you looking for? Every time I've gone into Wiggyville since we started filming the show, I've had at least one request for an autograph. Making sure I'm prepared. He shook his head. I can't believe you're still thinking about the fans first. They still pay my bills. Technically, the show's sponsors pay our bills. We wouldn't have the sponsors without the fans. All right. He wasn't going to argue with her. He really liked her attitude about doing the best thing for the fans. It showed she didn't take her blessings in life for granted. Am I dressed well enough? She looked down at her jeans and t-shirt. There's mud on my pants. So you won't be the ultra-glamorous star everyone expects you to be. Does that bother you? Not really. I'm human just like anyone else. If they can't see it, then they need to. I won't be idolized. He grinned. Not even by me? Nope. Not even by you. She threaded her fingers through his hand. I like being your wife. I'm glad, because you're stuck with me. Like glue. They were seated in a quiet corner of the restaurant, and she chose what she wanted before excusing herself to use the restroom. She could see in his eyes he wanted to follow her, but she shook her head. No way are you going to stand outside the bathroom and wait for me like I'm a child. He studied her for a moment as if trying to decide if she would be safe, but he finally nodded. Hurry. She rolled her eyes. I'll be fine. As she was washing her hands before going back to the table, her phone rang in her purse. She grabbed it, her mind immediately on alert. When she looked, she saw it was Ricky. Ricky. Are you all right? Sure she is, Curtis responded. She's with me. Why wouldn't she be all right? Hearing his voice sent cold chills down her spine. Curtis, where are you? He chuckled. Worried about your sister? Isn't it a little late for that? What have you done to her? Valerie closed her eyes, leaning against the counter in the bathroom. Is she okay? Sure, she's fine, for now. There was a short silence, and then she heard Ricky's voice. Valerie, I'm all right. He won't let me go, though. Her voice sounded as if she was crying. Where are you? Curtis responded. Why would you ask her that? I had her blindfolded when we came in. She has no idea. I'll tell you though. I'm at the motel at the corner of Main St. and First in Wiggyville. Room 122. Come alone, and I'll let her go. And what will happen to me? You'll be reminded who you belong to. Valerie closed her eyes. I'll be there in a minute. She hurried from the bathroom and out to the car, where she knew Jesse had left the handgun and ammunition. She didn't think twice as she took the gun from the glove box and carefully loaded it, pushing the safety on as Jesse had shown her. Sticking the pistol in the small of her back, she hurried down the street, determined to be the strong this one time. Her sister needed her, and she couldn't trust Curtis not to hurt her sister if she brought anyone with her. She walked the block down to the motel Curtis had mentioned, and taking a deep breath, knocked on the door of room 122. Curtis opened the door, a wide grin on his face. I knew you'd come back to me. Let Ricky go. How'd you get here so fast? I was having dinner here in town. Valerie kept her face averted, trying to make him think she was being timid. She didn't want him to realize she was stronger now, but as she stood there in front of him, hiding her anger, she realized she was. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, with him? Curtis grabbed her arm and pulled her into the room, slamming her against the wall. She ignored the pain where she hit and hurried to her sister, whose hands were tied in front of her. "You said you'd let her go." Curtis shrugged. "I don't care about her. Only you." She carefully untied her sister's hands. "Go to the steakhouse. It's only a block away. Jesse is there. Tell him who you are, and he'll take care of you." Valerie carefully kept her voice down as she gave her sister instructions, explaining how to get there. "Tell him I'm all right." Ricky nodded, rubbing her wrists. "Thank you for saving me." Valerie could tell her sister didn't want to leave her there, but she'd been a captive for 2 days. "Go." Ricky got off the bed and walked to the door. "Don't hurt my sister." Curtis pushed her out the door and locked it, turning back to Valerie. "Now I want to know why you married him. You belong to me." Chapter 10. Valerie's eyes met Curtis's for the first time since she'd entered the room. "Because I love him." His face turned red with rage. "You've loved me for 8 years. Don't lie to me. What did he do to force you to marry him?" "He didn't have to force me. I've loved him since the moment I set eyes on him." Well, since she set lips on him, but she didn't need to tell Curtis that. "I never loved you. I let you control me." "That's something entirely different." She knew she was making him angrier, but she couldn't help herself. She needed to tell him the truth. "Why are you trying to force me to punish you? You know you can't lie to me that way. Did you do it for the show? For the publicity?" She shook her head adamantly, her hand going to the small of her back and pulling out the gun, but leaving it out of his sight. She had to be ready. She knew he was going to come toward her at any moment. He wouldn't be able to resist hitting her for the things she was saying. She smiled sweetly. "Publicity was the last thing on my mind. Remember how you used to tell me how frigid I was? That I was too cold to ever respond to a man? It wasn't true. I was only cold with you. Jesse sets me on fire. I married the right man. The better man." Curtis shook his head, obviously having a hard time believing she was talking to him like that. "No. It's not true." Valerie suddenly felt powerful, more powerful than she'd ever felt with him. "Yes. I love my husband, and I'm so glad I married him." Jesse looked at the clock on his phone for the 15th time since Valerie left. Where was she? He stood up and walked to the hostess. "Would you check the restroom? My wife went in there a long time ago, and I'm worried about her." The blonde shook her head. "I saw her leave the restaurant at least 20 minutes ago." "What? Do you know where she was going?" "She didn't say anything to me. She went to your car, and then she started running down the street." Jesse closed his eyes, fear gripping him. She'd gone to rescue Ricky. There was no doubt in his mind. She must have gotten a call while she was in the bathroom, telling her where her sister was. He hoped she'd gone to the car for the handgun. He strode toward the exit, almost bumping into a girl no bigger than Valerie. "Sorry, miss." "Jesse." She grabbed his arm. "Valerie went to the motel down the street, so Curtis would let me go. She said to come to you and tell you she was okay, but I'm scared. He was so mad at her for marrying you." He'd never seen the girl before, but there was no doubt in his mind this was his new sister-in-law. "Ricky, I need you to call the police." "Do you have a phone?" She shook her head. "No. He took it from me." Tears were streaming down her face, and her clothes were dirty and wrinkled, but she was a beauty just like her sister. Jesse looked at the hostess. "Can she use your phone to call the police?" The hostess nodded, her eyes wide. This kind of situation didn't happen often in the sleepy little town of Wiggyville, Texas. "Tell me where Valerie is. Do you know the room number?" 122. "She's in there with him." Ricky was practically hysterical. Jesse put his hand on her arm for a moment to calm her before turning and running out the door. It was just minutes before he was at the hotel, pounding on the door to the room. "Valerie. Are you okay?" I'm fine, she called back. A moment later the door opened, and she handed him the gun in her hands, before flinging herself at him. There were no tears, but she was shaking hysterically. Where is he? Jesse couldn't see Curtis anywhere. He heard a groan from the other side of the bed, and pushing Valerie behind him, he hurried over to look down at the injured man on the floor. You shot him. He turned to Valerie with a combination of shock and pride in his eyes. Of course, I shot him. He was about to kill me with his bare hands. Jesse looked at her for a moment, before looking back down at the man on the floor. It looked like she'd shot him in the shoulder. Why was he going to kill you? He'd been sure Curtis would hit her, but killing her had seemed out of the realm of possibilities. Because I told him I married you because I loved you. He wanted me to tell him you forced me. Why did you tell him that? Jesse wasn't quite able to understand what was happening. He heard the sirens outside and breathed a sigh of relief. Soon he'd have her alone. Because it's the truth. What? He looked back at her quickly, not feeling like he could keep his eyes off Curtis for long. You love me? This wasn't a conversation he wanted to have in front of other people, but he had to know exactly what she was telling him. She nodded. Since the first moment we kissed, I craved to be with you. I spent all my time thinking about you. I don't know why I didn't realize it sooner. You have the worst sense of timing of any woman I've ever met. Do you know that? She laughed. Why? I promised myself I wouldn't tell you until the danger from Curtis was over. It's over. Now I'm telling you. Jesse felt his heart pounding in his chest. His arms ached to hold her, but he didn't trust Curtis not to have a weapon on him, so he continued to stand there with his handgun pointed at the other man. Ricky called the police for us. On cue, 2 police officers rushed into the room. The same officer who had helped them with the restraining order was one of them. He looked at Jesse. Drop your weapon. Jesse immediately did as he was told, backing away from the gun. Just making sure things didn't get out of hand before you got here. That him? Officer Hamilton asked Valerie. She nodded. I shot him when he came after me. He kidnapped my sister in Iowa and brought her here. Where's your sister? I don't know. She looked at Jesse. She went to get my husband, and she's the one who called you. Is she still at the steak place? I have no idea. Jesse frowned. I guess someone should go see if she's there. Ricky stumbled into the room. I'm here. Officer Hamilton turned to Ricky, while his partner helped Curtis onto the bed. We're going to need an ambulance, the partner said, pulling his radio off his belt. He quickly explained the situation. Officer Hamilton asked, Can you tell me what happened? Ricky explained about how he'd approached her outside the grocery store where she worked. He told me that he needed to talk to someone who loved Valerie as much as he did. I thought he was really hurting because of their breakup. She looked over at Valerie, her eyes pleading for understanding. Valerie leaned against Jesse, her back to his chest. You have a soft heart. Ricky brushed away a tear. And it almost got you killed. She sniffled. So I got in his van with him so we could go get a cup of coffee and talk. He drove us out of town, and I realized what he was doing, so I told him to pull over. I figured I could walk back to town. Instead, he tied my hands together and forced me in the back of the van he was driving. Jesse listened, his arms around his wife. He so badly wanted to be alone with her to talk, but he knew they needed to get this over with first. So he drove you here from Iowa? Officer Hamilton prompted. She nodded. He took me on Thursday night. Do you know if your disappearance was reported? Jesse nodded. I know it was. I talked to her mother on Friday, and she was filing a police report then. All right, go on. Officer Hamilton was making note of everything Ricky said. He brought me here. I had no idea where we were until he got on the phone with my sister. He called her from my phone because he said she'd blocked his calls. Officer Hamilton met Valerie's eyes. I talked to her a couple of weeks ago about the situation. She had already blocked his calls then. Well, he called her and told her how to find me. Then he let me talk to her for a minute, so she'd know I was all right. Why didn't you call the police at that point, Mrs. Savoy? Valerie met the officer's eyes. I was afraid he'd hurt Ricky if I didn't follow his instructions exactly. Where were you when you received the call? Jesse and I spent time in the field near the set today. He taught me how to shoot, because we were worried I'd need to defend myself. When we were finished, we came into town to eat at the little steakhouse down the road. She took a deep breath, finding strength in her husband's touch. I went to the restroom, and while I was in there, I got the phone call. So I went to the car, got the handgun we'd been practicing with, and I loaded it. Curtis never expected me to fight back, so he didn't look for it. I see. Did you just come in and shoot him? Or did he threaten you? Valerie put her hand over Jesse's, where it was resting on her waist. I whispered to Ricky to go to Jesse while I untied her hands. After Ricky was out of the room, he asked why I'd married my husband. I was honest with him, and told him I loved Jesse. That made him angry, and he got agitated. He told me he was going to kill me, and he walked toward me with his hands outstretched, so I shot him. I was aiming for his shoulder. I didn't want to kill him, but I needed him not to hurt me. Officer Hamilton jotted down a few more notes. It sounds like you did the right thing. Well, except for the fact that you should have informed the police instead of coming in to save your sister yourself. You do realize how dangerous that was, don't you? She nodded. I also knew I couldn't be responsible for anything happening to my sister. I see. He wrote something else. The paramedics came in then, taking Curtis out on a stretcher and stalling the discussion. Officer Hamilton's partner went with them. Once they were gone, Officer Hamilton turned to Valerie. I don't think I'm going to have a problem corroborating your story. If I have more questions, I'll contact you on the set. Valerie nodded. Thank you. She turned to her sister. You're coming back with us tonight. We'll call Mom together. I was hoping you wouldn't want me to stay in this hotel room. Never. Valerie turned in Jesse's arms. Amber is on set. I'm sure she'll be happy to have Ricky stay with her. I'm sure she's not going to want to be alone for a while. I hope so, Jesse whispered, his words only loud enough for her to hear. I need my wife all to myself tonight. He knew it was selfish with her sister having gone through so much, but he needed her to tell him she loved him again. And he needed to be able to hear it repeatedly as he held her and made love with her. The three of them walked down the street back to Jesse's car. We never did eat, he said with a frown. I'm not up to sitting and eating a steak at this point. I want to get back. Valerie's eyes met Jesse's, and he understood her completely. Fast food it is, Ricky said from her position in the back seat. I'm starving. He hasn't been feeding me much. Oh, I never thought of that. We can go to the restaurant if you want. I don't want. I want to get somewhere I can sleep. Ricky yawned. I haven't exactly slept much either. They drove through a chain fast food place and ordered their food. Ricky was asleep before they even got there. Valerie ordered for her sister, and they drove back to the set. When they arrived, she woke Ricky. We need to eat. Ricky got out of the car, not quite steady on her feet. She followed Valerie into her trailer. This is our home away from home. Ricky barely glanced around, sitting down at the small table and eating the burger in front of her. While she ate, Valerie called their mother. Mom, he brought her here. She's safe. Curtis is in the hospital. What did Jesse do to him? Valerie bit her lip for a moment. Nothing. I shot him. She couldn't believe how proud she was that she'd put a bullet through another human. She'd done what she needed to do to protect herself and her sister though, and that's what mattered. She could almost hear her mother's surprise across the phone line. You shot him? Really? Really? He's in the hospital, but he'll be going to jail. Can I talk to Ricky? Valerie looked at her sister. Mom needs to hear your voice, I think. Ricky took the phone, still munching on a French fry. Hey, Mom. Yeah, I'm good. Jesse is just as sexy in person as he is on television, but he only has eyes for Valerie. Yeah, I guess it's good he loves his wife so much, but it would be nice if he just looked at me like I was beautiful for 1 minute. Valerie bit her lip to stifle a laugh, turning to Jesse. Have I mentioned my sister has a huge celebrity crush on you? Jesse grinned at her. I don't think you did. She does. Valerie's eyes were full of laughter as they met his. I gather that. She took the step that separated them into his arms and wrapped her arms around him. I love you so much, she whispered, her lips going to his. Mom, they're kissing right in front of me. Yeah, it looks just like it does when they kiss on television. They're getting me all hot and bothered. Valerie ignored her sister as she clung to her husband. I'm going to wander over to Amber's so she can come meet Ricky and let her spend the night. Do you think she'll mind? Valerie shook her head. I don't think so. She's so happy we're together, she'll do anything to give us some privacy. Valerie walked 2 trailers down and brought her friend back. When they arrived, Jessie was on the phone with her mother. I think she probably does need a day or 2 to recover. We'll put her on a plane on Monday evening. I think she'd enjoy watching a day of filming. He paused, a grin on his face. I think that's a wonderful idea. We'll pick you up tomorrow. Text me with your flight information. He ended the call and looked at Valerie. Your mom is going to fly in tomorrow. She doesn't think Ricky should fly alone yet, and she wants to meet your new husband. Valerie sighed. I've been married for over 3 weeks. I'm practically an old married woman now. She looked at Amber. Amber, this is my sister, Ricky. Ricky, my best friend, Amber. It's nice to meet you, Ricky said, stars in her eyes. I can't believe I get to meet so many famous people all at once. She smiled. Of course, it's like Amber and I are the same person, since Amber plays Joe's sister. Amber smiled. Well, this famous person has decided you're her sister and not her, so let's go to my place. You're camping with me tonight. Ricky frowned. I don't have any clothes. Valerie went to her closet and pulled out jeans and a t-shirt as well as a pair of pajamas. There. We're the same size. Ricky took the clothes and hugged her sister. Thank you, no problem. After Ricky and Amber had left, Valerie turned to Jessie. I'm sorry I scared you. Don't ever do that to me again. What were you thinking? She sighed. I knew you'd be mad, but I had to do it myself. I had to prove to myself that I'm a strong, capable woman. Jessie walked to her, pulling her against him. You are a very strong, capable woman. I don't know how no one sees it. So you're going to quit trying to surround me with bubble wrap? He shrugged. Now that Curtis is in custody, I will let you do what you want. He kissed her softly. As long as you keep telling me you love me. She smiled up into his eyes, her arms wrapping around his shoulders. I love everything about you. You are the man of my dreams, and I'm so sorry I didn't realize it years ago. It did me good to wait. Taught me patience. She snorted at that. Sure it did. He grinned. Okay, it made me think about learning patience. I do love you, Jessie Savoy. And I love you, Valerie Savoy. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Starting with tonight. He carried her to the bedroom. Epilogue. 2 months later, Jessie handed Valerie the script for their season finale. He sat next to her on the couch in the trailer they shared, flipping through his while she read over hers. Her eyes lit up, and she squealed. I get to say yes, this time. Finally. He chuckled. Stephen told me they were going to write in another proposal. She put her hand on her still flat stomach. They need to. By the time we start filming for the next season after a month off, I'm going to be showing. She flipped a couple of more pages. We're doing a quick wedding a week after the proposal at the ranch. Oh good. Poor Dylan is tired of waiting for Joe to put out. She giggled. As tired as Jessie was of waiting for Valerie the Virgin? Somehow the name no longer bothered her. Oh, no. Not nearly that tired of waiting. Jesse was about to die when you married him. She grinned, resting her head against his shoulder. Well, now neither Jesse nor Dylan will have to die. Curtis accepted a plea bargain today. Jesse kept his voice soft and even, knowing the subject was still sensitive, but not nearly as much so as it was. How long will he serve? 30 years. And he's agreed to undergo psychiatric help as well. He won't be eligible for parole for 20 years. She let out the breath she'd been holding. Good. I hope he gets the help he needs while he's there. You do? You don't hate him? He's not someone I care to be around, but I'm not going to waste my energy hating him. That would only hurt me. I feel sorry for him really. I'm married to the man I love, and we're expecting our first child. I have a career that seems to only be going up. He's spending at least the next 20 years in prison. No, I pity him. Jesse pulled her to him and kissed her softly. One of the things I like best about you is your huge heart. She smiled, touching the tip of her finger to his nose playfully. You know what I like best about you? He shook his head. What? Your refusal to give up on me. I couldn't. I saw clearly that someday we'd be right here. I'd have you in my arms, and have the right to make love with you anytime I could talk you into it. Valerie kissed his chin. You don't seem to have any trouble talking me into that or anything else. He grinned. I know. Life is good,